This story begins somewhere in the forests of Lemuria. There were screams coming from the forest. A little boy named Hercules was riding a horse at breakneck speed and shouting that he would never want to be emperor. He was the third prince of the weak and dying empire of Lemuria. Due to the death of his father, the now deceased Emperor Hadrian III, the position of emperor became vacant. He was originally not supposed to be allowed as heir to the throne, but since his two older brothers were very poorly raised, they were not fit to be heirs. He is now forced to take the place of the next emperor. The idea of being the emperor of a small and weak country, let alone a great one, is more unbearable to him than any form of torture. Because of his stupid brothers, he must now become the emperor of a country that may soon be destroyed. He only wanted to live a quiet and leisurely life for the rest of his days. A man on a horse rode up behind him and asked him not to be selfish. Hearing a voice, Hercules realized that he had been caught up. He recognized the voice of a girl named Caroline. She was his childhood friend and was used to always following him. He never would have thought that she would go this far to catch him. The girl asked him to stop and asked why he was running away. Looking back, Hercules clarified with her if she was still chasing him. Caroline replied that if she wasn't chasing him, she certainly wouldn't catch him. Caroline asked him to stop running away and become emperor. The guy thought to himself that she was messing with him. He wasn't going to become emperor of a weak and empty country that would soon be destroyed. After catching up to Hercules, Caroline hit him right on the head, causing the guy to collapse to the ground. After that, she jumped off the horse herself and sat right on the lying hero. Caroline gave him a stern look and said she had caught him. Hercules looked angrily at the girl. The Lemurian Empire used to have a territory that stretched across 3 continents and was the world's greatest military, economic, and cultural power. It left its mark on the world. Leaving its mark on the world, this empire was built by the elves. But this country, once heralded as the most powerful nation in the world, was divided by civil war into East and West, and the western half of the country was destroyed. The Eastern Lemurian Empire also continued to decline due to invasions by various races. This was a territory that had lost 60% of its holdings and was still in decline. And trade in a country that was deprived of many grain lands and access to the sea was becoming almost impossible. At the same time, the deficit was only growing. He was chosen to be the next emperor of such a problematic and weak empire. Maybe there was some reason for that. Once the 19th emperor of the Lemur Empire, Hadrian III, approached the boys in the field. He asked how they were doing and how they were doing. In response, the elf bowed and said that, thanks to His Majesty's efforts, everything was going well. The elf smiled and said that if everything went as well as it did, the country would not starve this year. The king expected this and asked for forgiveness for all the hardships. Turning to Hercules, the king asked how he was doing. He told the boy that they were living in a very large land, and they would decide how this country would develop in the future. The girl called Hercules, who was 4 years old. But the boy did not listen to her. Sitting right in the field, he was reading a book. Approaching the boy, the king suggested that Hercules give him a tour of the lands, after which he could finish reading the book later. Staring silently into the distance, the boy said it was just a wheat field and preferred to continue reading the book. The king snatched the book out of Hercules' hands and said that whoever wrote this book saw the world as it is. This book captures the world. He told the boy that just by reading the book, he would not be able to experience the same emotions as in life. When the boy looked around, he saw 2 laborers and asked his father what they were doing. They were picking wheat from the ears so that they could then use those grains to make bread, which they ate. Seeing how hard they were at it, Hercules said that they didn't seem to be comfortable using those sticks. Poking at the workers with his fingers, the boy suggested using something like a comb instead of sticks. The king was surprised and thought for a moment. People would be delighted at how easy it was, and their hands would not get tired at all. You could thresh several ears at once. Instead of relying on the strength of one hand, it is much easier to pull the fruit with both hands, relying on one's own weight. And if a small platform were made, even small children could do it. Hercules smiled and told the king that this would save them a lot of effort and greatly increase their productivity. The king was delighted and told Hercules that this was great. But the king didn't understand how he knew all this, and the boy said that they had been around since the Edo times and were created by farmers who were creating different innovative tools at that time. But the king looked at him in surprise, not understanding what he meant. The guy was confused and didn't know what to answer and said that he had read about it in a foreign book. The king grinned and said that his son was a know-it-all. The lad looked sullenly at his father and thought about the fact that there was no such thing in their library and archives. He had one secret. He had knowledge of more advanced science and technology that he kept secret. People often called him a prodigy, and his father gave him everything he ever asked for. But it is because of this knowledge that he is now losing his freedom, and he is greatly overrated. Still sitting on the guy, Caroline asked him to finally become emperor. Looking at the girl's legs, the guy blushed and asked her to get off her, saying she was heavy. Carolina asked him if he would run away again and if she would get off. Not understanding anything she said about feeling something hard from below, Hercules cried out and began to beat the ground with his hand. The girl still begged him to become emperor. He has the knowledge and ability to be one. But the boy replied that it would never happen. He wanted to travel when he grew up. That's why now he was accumulating knowledge, and he wasn't going to become a slave of this country. He asked to finally get off of him, saying that he would not be imprisoned by the emperor. This only meant that he didn't want to be with her, but the guy didn't understand what she meant. She said that she loved this country and wanted to protect it, where his father, Emperor Hadrian himself, ruled. She always wanted to see a new Lemurian empire created by Hercules himself. Drowning in tears, Caroline said she would like to see Hercules become emperor. The boy was shocked. He was confused and asked the girl why she was crying. Gritting his teeth, Hercules swallowed the lump in his throat and thought he would have to. Exhaling heavily, the boy talked about taking Caroline with him on the trip. After she stopped crying, she wiped away her tears and asked if it was true. Hercules patted the girl's head and said he would do anything she wanted for her. She asked if he would let her read her martial arts book that his mother had forbidden his mother to read. She also asked if he would come to tea and would he become emperor. The boy agreed to everything, but then he saw the girl's angry look that looked right at him. He had just been tricked. Grabbing the hero by the scruff of the neck and dragging her behind him, the guy asked her what she was doing. The girl turned to him and said that a warrior must use any weapon to win, for that was what his father had always said. Caroline dragged the hero behind her, and the boy shouted at her that she had tricked him, and thus he stood before all his subjects. So he ascended the throne safely and became emperor. Sitting in the king's chair and putting his feet up on the table, Hercules contemplated how much it sucked to be stuck in a country like this. The ongoing trade deficit, a territory that continues to shrink due to invasion by other races. Because of all this, the nation continues to lose its territorial viability. The hero could not believe that his father had died ruling such a country. The hero's freedom lasted so little, and so his imperial life began. Then Hercules felt a kind of evil and tense aura from behind him that appeared with a certain girl. She smiled and told Hercules that she was right. The voice said that he was destined to become emperor. This girl gave him a lot of knowledge about the other world, so she hoped that Hercules would succeed. It was true, the hero has a lot of knowledge from the other world, but originally it was not his. The one who owned this knowledge was born and raised on planet Earth in a country called Japan. His name was Shichi, and all the problems the hero has had so far. He was only able to solve them because he has knowledge from another world. The cause of all this, the work of this bizarre demoness. Angry, the guy asked if she had any idea how much of a headache he had afterward. In his other life, he was such a boring and stupid person. Still, this knowledge was certainly useful. Disappearing, the demoness said in parting that she had high hopes for the hero. She said that Hercules was a future great hero. The room became quiet. The boy grabbed his head and screamed. He immediately wanted to abdicate. An elf passing by grinned and said that Hercules didn't look like a man who had just ascended to the throne. It was Hercules' uncle, Christopher Augustus. Hercules asked him if the man was really his relative, although he didn't look like a member of his family at all. Anyway, Hercules was sure that he was the one who suggested the idea to his father. Even though Hercules had two brothers, but his uncle always put him above them. He was like a pain in the ass to him. Christopher said thoughtfully that he didn't recall him doing anything in particular. But Hadrian himself had talked a lot about Hercules. After all, he could talk as early as 3 years old, could read and write. At the age of 4, he had read all the books in the castle, and that was not enough for him. And his father was very happy, telling that Hercules studied martial arts one after another without getting tired at all. The hero turned away from Christopher and repeatedly told him to shut up. In addition, the uncle heard that the hero invented Sembakoki, thereby increasing the efficiency of wheat harvesting. and since then, their wheat production has been increasing exponentially. Christopher smiled and said that the people and the former emperor were very happy about it. In any case, he felt that his ascension to the throne was the right decision. The boy put his head on the table and dreamed of the rebellion against him. Just then, the doors swung open and the man addressed his imperial majesty. Uncle smiled and said that this was the man who was going to revolutionize the atmosphere. Hercules was not thrilled and thought about how Galfes really always has bad timing. Galfes was the father of Caroline. He apologized to his majesty. He spoke so loudly that the uncle and the hero covered their ears. Galfes told them that from now on, they should always talk to him about matters concerning the administration of the empire. The patriarch of the new Lemuria, Lucanos, came up behind Galfes and asked him not to talk like that. Hercules gave the patriarch a displeased look and asked Lucanos if he had always been here. Lucanos exclaimed to the majesty that he was just awful. There was a maternal relative, a military man, a eunuch, and him, the 12-year-old emperor. He was certain that this country was doomed. Rising from his chair, he told the heroes that they could continue to play politics on their own, holding out his crown to them. Meanwhile, all he wanted to do was enjoy himself in the library while everything went to hell. The patriarch smiled sadly and said there was nothing to be done about it. They would have to rely on Lady Caroline again. Looking out of the library window, Hercules thought what a terrible world he had been born into to become emperor of a dying country. And millions of people cried out to him to save their country. Putting the book in front of him, the guy said that only they give him quiet peace and rest. There was much knowledge waiting for him outside this castle, but only they helped him to know his true nature. Lifting his head up, the hero smiled. Books were his best partner to get him out of this cramped world. Opening a book, he asked her what kind of world they would offer him today, but no sooner had he immersed himself in that world than Caroline popped out of the corner and startled the hero. Hercules looked nervously at the girl, who exclaimed that he was here again. She had heard about him shirking his job again. Hercules realized that she was already aware of everything. He told her that there were already a lot of people here, so he didn't have to get involved in politics. He also reminded her that he didn't make them all do it. Just the title of emperor was enough for him. Caroline asked him if he understood anything about politics. The guy turned to the girl and asked her what she had just said. Caroline turned away and said she was sorry, despite the fact that he was recognized by Hadrian herself. She called it a shame, for she thought that Hercules could have solved this country's financial problems in an instant. Apparently she was wrong. After all, Hercules herself was only 12 years old. Carolina sternly asked what his father would think if he heard that. She felt a dark aura behind her. Getting up from the floor, Hercules asked her if she really thought he was a child. Of course he knew about politics. He wondered how much knowledge she thought he had about the world. Hercules said it would be easy once he understood fully what the problem was. Turning around, Caroline asked if he could do anything about it now, angering the hero. He did agree with her, if she was so insistent on it. He promised that he would improve the financial situation of the empire within 5 years, but then he thought about it and said he would do it in just 3 years. Pointing his finger at her, the hero said that if he really solved all the problems, she would fulfill one request of his. The girl hesitated for a moment. Caroline was willing to do whatever he asked. A snide grin appeared on Hercules' face, and he told her that she had agreed to do it herself. This is the story of the hard journey of the young Emperor Hercules, who used his knowledge to conquer 3 continents as Emperor of Divine Light. The current state of the Lemurian Empire was deplorable. They were suffering from loss of territory, a deteriorating tax system, a critical fiscal budget deficit, increased military spending, and a host of other problems. New Lemuria, the capital of the empire, better known as the city where 2/3 of the world's wealth is located. The empire has amassed vast wealth from the smuggling of goods through its territory. The empire's prosperity, sustained over the years, is supported by transit trade, aided by its favorable location. However, this transit trade has 2 disadvantages. The first of which depends on the political environment and economic conditions of imports and exports at the destination. And the second, in this case, all the wealth will inevitably flow through a neighboring country, namely the greatest empire's main adversary, the Kingdom of Furs. Hercules looked at the bookshelves, looking for a book. Taking the book in his hands, he opened it. He thought about the fact that the Lemurian Empire needed to find another source of income that did not depend on the transit trade. After he summoned all the heroes, the servants were simply shocked and delighted that he was finally motivated to do it. Carolina, Uncle, and the others looked among themselves. The uncle wept and told Hercules that now that he had made this decision, he was the very real emperor. They rejoiced that they could prevent the destruction of the Lemurian Empire. The guy looked at them unhappily and thought about the fact that he hadn't even done anything yet. Gilphes stroked his daughter's head and praised her for her work. Hercules looked at the girl gloomily. He remembered his promise to improve the country in just 3 years. Hercules thought of what a fool he was, but there was nothing he could do about it now. The patriarch asked if it wasn't a crazy idea to try to improve the financial situation in just 3 years. Closing the book, the guy agreed with him and suggested he start by exporting goods easily. With the exception of wheat, which is a staple food in the empire, grapes and olives were also grown here. Grapes and olives are processed into the empire's main exports, wine and olive oil. As for handicrafts, the empire produces high-quality glass and ceramics. These are the main export and financial resources of the empire. But also all the countries of the world produce these goods. And the handicraft industry of the First Kingdom is no worse than that of the Lemurian Empire. Because of the competition with them, they make almost no profit. They had to start somewhere to rebuild their finances. Hercules thought about creating a special product of Lemuria, and the heroes pondered his words. The door was opened by the maids. One of the maids was carrying a tray of mugs, and then began to fill the mugs with drink. Having poured boiling water, she placed the mug on the table, and the heroes were surprised at the black color. Taking the mug, Hercules asked them not to hold back, for he had only been made. They looked questioningly at the hero, not understanding what this drink was. The guy offered them a taste. Sniffing, Christopher said about the drink having a strange odor. Everyone took a cup each and tried it. Gilphes wrinkled his face and said it was gross. But the patriarch smiled and said he liked it, feeling invigorated. Caroline assumed it was some kind of medicine, as the drink was bitter. Taking the mug from her, he poured milk into it and stirred it, letting her taste it again. Looking into the mug, Caroline was surprised to see a coffee cat drawn. Her eyes sparkled and she smiled. Hercules said he added the same thing to the others' mugs and asked her to try again. Everyone obeyed him and took a couple sips. Gilphes was surprised and said that the drink was easier to drink now, but the patriarch still liked it the way it was before. With a mustache like foam under her nose, the girl told Hercules that it was delicious. The boy pointed to the mug and said that this drink was called coffee. The uncle tried to repeat after him. Caroline asked her father if he knew of such a thing, but no one had heard of anything like it. Wiping Carolina's mustache, the boy smiled and said he had learned about this drink on a trip a few years ago. It was grown in the church so that the ministers could be in a state of vigor for a long time. There are few water sources in this country, and water that is drinkable is very difficult to obtain. That is why the main drinks of Lemuria are grape wine and beer, which can be stored for long periods of time. But if you drink that, you end up getting drunk. So aristocrats who have money drink tea imported from the East. But it's still very expensive because of the imports. On the other hand, coffee is completely unavailable on the market, with no established methods of production. Above all, it could be grown under the climate and soil quality of Lemuria. It was only natural that if they marketed it as a special product of the empire, it would attract a certain amount of attention. Things became clear to the heroes. Christopher was in agreement with Hercules that coffee was worth selling as a special product, but still he talked about how he was not impressed with it. Hercules did not understand what he meant. Just to show them this drink, he bought out a tea set from one of the silk countries in the East. White porcelain that can technically only be produced in the silk lands of the East is very expensive. Surely the hero knows this. The guy picked up the mug and said that this porcelain was made in Lemuria, from which everyone was shocked again. Patriarch Lucanos said that this was simply impossible, for white porcelain was the patent of the silk country of the East. Even the kingdom of Furs didn't have such technology, let alone Lemuria. His words did not surprise the hero. Hercules told them that it was bone china made in London around the 18th century. Caroline didn't even know what London was. The white color of this porcelain comes from animal bones. He meant that until now, all the porcelain they made was black, so he decided to replace it with white. Actually, it was still in the experimental stage, but the white color was very beautiful. The shocked uncle grabbed Hercules by the shoulders and exclaimed that it was marvelous. For a long time he had thought that Lemuria was stagnant, but it turns out it had such exquisite technology. Galfes never would have thought that his majesty would show them something so amazing and so sudden. Hercules thought to himself that he still had to pay quite a bit to have the craftsman who made this porcelain make it as quickly as possible as he left the palace. However, it was still far from perfect. And for now, they had too little coffee to put it on sale. First, they needed to raise money and find artisans capable of making porcelain to start mass production, and get the ministers of the churches to grow coffee on their property. First, they would sell a 2-piece set, bone china, and coffee to the aristocrats and merchants. They were sure to make a good profit if sold as a set. Hercules smiled and said that they would sell the coffee and the bone china. They would sell all of these as special products of the empire. The heroes understood his scheme, and they supported him. Because of this, they have hope for a small financial recovery. Caroline suggested that they start selling them. The guy thought about the fact that until they established a monopoly on these products, porcelain and coffee would never make a difference. And even if they managed to do so, the empire's financial situation would improve in at least 5 years. But he had to do all this in just 3 years. Now, all Hercules had to do was to dig through the administrative documents. After arriving at the library and finding a pile of books, the boy took a quill and began to draw a chart on a wooden malbert to which a piece of paper was attached. Hercules looked at the image thoughtfully. 3 months after he started digging through the administrative documents, he finally figured out the reason. Taking his mug, he sipped his coffee and looked at the graph again. Sitting around the multitudes of scrolls and books, it was just as he had suspected. Increased military spending and worsening tax efficiency. When all the servants were gathered around a table led by Hercules, he motioned for them to begin. He apologized for such a sudden meeting, but the lad was thinking about the urgent need for them to take action against the empire. One of the guys at the table asked if it was normal to have a 12-year-old boy sitting at the head. Carolina looked at him unhappily. Turning to the boy, Hercules told him that he hadn't seen him here before. Worried, the boy held up a clipboard with paper and said that his name was Kroll, and that he would be in charge of all records today. Taking the mug in his hands and pointing a finger at Kroll, Hercules asked him to tell them about their taxation system. Kroll read that the imperial taxation system consisted of 6 types of taxes: land tax, per capita tax, trade tax, import tax, military tax, and slave emancipation tax. But in addition to this, their state has a monopoly on salt. Hercules thanked him and told him he was doing well, asking him to keep it up. Kroll was surprised that his majesty praised him. The hero mentioned the tax systems he had just talked about. He told the people that the per capita tax, the trade tax, the import tax, the tax on freeing a slave, and the salt monopoly should be abolished and revised. Everyone fell into a deep slump, looking at Hercules in shock. They asked that he repeat all this. People didn't understand. How would they collect taxes if they canceled them? The guy asked them to calm down and decided to explain it all to them. First of all, it was the per capita tax. The uncle handed the hero a paper with statistics on it. Taking it, the hero said that it was a list about the people in the empire from whom they collected the per capita tax. Holding the sheet out to Kroll, Hercules asked him what he thought of it. Taking the list, the boy noticed that there were too many women on it. Hercules jabbed his finger at him and said that he had hit the mark. Moreover, there are too many people with disabilities. The per capita tax in the empire is higher for men than for women, and the tax for people with physical disabilities is even lower. These reports are simple pieces of paper. A family of 4 men and 2 women can get a tax break simply by writing down that there are 2 men and 4 women in their family. But there are 10 million people in this country, and all the people could not be verified. And since they couldn't verify it, people started attributing visual and hearing impairments to themselves and evading taxes in every way possible. And they succeeded. Showing everyone a sheet of statistics, Hercules asked them if they could say with complete certainty that this information was correct. He didn't want a taxation system that couldn't collect taxes correctly. Taking a sip from his cup, he demanded that it be repealed. The council didn't even say anything to him. Kroll thought to himself, "This is just amazing." Those noisy bureaucrats were now silent and couldn't say anything. Hercules apologized to Kroll for often talking about everything and asked him to tell them about how the merchant tax was collected. A merchant's tax rate was calculated based on his profits and type of goods. Hercules asked him how they knew the exact amount of his sales income, and the guy replied that they relied on their word. Hercules got as close as possible to Kroll's face and blurted out that that's the point, you can just lie. The merchants were free to falsify figures. They may say one amount of revenue, but in reality it will turn out to be quite different. It is true that the tax levied on trade provides a significant amount of revenue. They should pay what they earn as a national liability. That is why he is going to change the policy of taxing trade. But given labor, time, and manpower, they couldn't afford an unannounced inspection. Therefore, it had to be revised. Hercules looked at the sheet thinking about what they would have next. A tax on imports, which only impeded the flow of goods, bringing only a small amount of revenue to the treasury. Next came the tax on freeing a slave. Slaves were no longer freed in their day, and Hercules was not happy that they still had this dusty system of taxation. He decided they would abolish both. Kroll was shocked. 4 taxation systems were abolished or sent for reconsideration in the blink of an eye. Taking a sip from his mug, Hercules approached the salt monopoly as well. This is a policy that was adopted during the reign of the late Emperor Hadrian. It helped the empire gain a new source of income, and what the empire couldn't collect through the per capita tax. It was compensated for all by the sale of salt, selling at 30 times its normal value. The people needed salt, so they bought it regardless of the cost. The hero smiled and told the bureaucrats that this was certainly marvelous, but he had found something. The patriarch Lucanos came up behind him, carrying a tray in his hands. He took the pouch from the tray and placed it right on the table in front of everyone. The people asked the hero in amazement, "What is this?" Kroll looked at the sack just as surprised. Turning to Caroline, Hercules offered to taste what the salt tasted like. The girl came up and took the salt on her finger. Tasting it, she said that it was ordinary salt. It was better and cheaper than the monopolized salt. This was illegal salt, and it was much better than the monopolized salt of the empire. Moreover, it was sold throughout the imperial capital at a rather cheap price. The fact that this salt was being sold on the streets only meant that there was someone who was quietly pulling the strings behind him. There was no way he was going to accept that. All the bureaucrats wouldn't even look at him, bowing their heads to their desks. Hercules looked at the bureaucrats sternly and asked if they were mocking his father's tax system. Hercules asked them if any of them bought the monopolized salt of the empire at all. Kroll looked at the reaction of the bureaucrats in horror and thought to himself that it simply couldn't be. Judging from the way they kept silent and lowered their gazes, it was immediately clear that they were buying smuggled salt. Unexpectedly, Hercules smiled and apologized to everyone. The bureaucrats looked at the new king with horror and surprise. It was obvious that this system was unsustainable and bad in every way, because it was only invented to compensate for a broken tax system. Hercules decided to abolish it as well. Furthermore, he was willing to turn a blind eye to the issue of smuggled salt. But he had one condition, and the bureaucrats asked him what that condition was. What Hercules asked was that the merchants form a labor union. The bureaucrats were surprised at this, and Kroll looked questioningly at the hero. When using traditional methods for the merchants, it is obvious that they falsify the amount of income, and it is impossible to keep track of exactly what they do. If they formed a union, the number of people who would have to verify income would be reduced, and they could cross-check between the union and the merchants, and between the other unions, which would allow the government to gain some degree of control over the economy through the unions. Kroll's fear was that if a union was established, it would cause prices to rise. If they set a price on one thing, it would encourage others to raise prices so that they could also make a profit. As for the price, they would set the highest price and force the merchants to do the same. But many of them here thought that trade was a nefarious business. The bureaucrat also said that money was not made by simple buying and selling, but by thinking and intelligence. Hercules asked him in surprise how he made his living with such a mindset, with such a thought. The hero said that if there aren't many buyers, then they should just team up with merchants to figure out how to sell them. If you just suddenly raise the price of something, no one will buy it and it will rot. They also know that the merchants have formed their own alliance, albeit unofficially. So Hercules suggested that they use this to their advantage. Hercules waved to the military man that he had attached sheets to each bureaucrat. Hercules told them that he had invented a new system of taxation. He would also like them to contribute to it as well. Now there were no emperors or bureaucrats here. Now they were just at a gathering of people who wanted to restore the Lemurian Empire and those who could do it. Hercules asked them not to be afraid to challenge their decision. In fact, he thought about the fact that bureaucrats don't get much, which surprised people. Therefore, if they were successful in fiscal reforms, he would personally see to it that their salaries were fair. He smiled and asked the defeated bureaucrats to do a good job. All the people immediately became animated and started asking their questions. Thus began a heated debate in the conference room, which continued for 3 days and nights. And as a result, after many revisions and adjustments, a new taxation system was finally established and promulgated throughout the empire. And 2 years later, after the new taxation system was promulgated, the empire's tax revenues increased to about 1.5 times what they had been 2 years earlier. And the use of taxes, such as the staff expenses of the imperial palace, was revised to reduce the expenditure of the national treasury. In addition, all treasures that were part of the imperial household's property and had no historical value were evenly sold. Thus, the treasury of the Lemurian Empire safely began to recover. And the new Emperor Hercules, at the age of 14, was firmly supported by merchants supporting national logistics. Caroline's eyes shone, and the girl exclaimed that this was just great. She was thrilled that Hercules was actually able to solve the problem of empire in less than 3 years. The boy was smug and knew it, and asked Caroline to stroke his head. The girl agreed, but then got embarrassed and turned away from him, holding her cheeks. She asked Hercules if he was sure he wanted to go out on the town. If he went to such a crowded place, it was bound to cause a ruckus. But the guy said it was okay, because to Carolina, he's still the same Hercules he's always been. And in the eyes of the rest of the world, he's not who they think he is. Caroline assumed he was using some kind of magic, but the guy asked her to be quiet. He asked Caroline not to address him as emperor. In any case, she wanted to make sure that Hercules wasn't going to disguise himself by using magic to leave the castle and miss his official duties. Guy said that Christopher and the others would take care of it. He held out his hand to Caroline and said that he wanted to introduce her to the 4 landmarks of Lemuria today. Caroline asked in surprise what the landmarks were. The first landmark he wanted to show her was here. They came to a museum that was full of large statues. Carolina was surprised at how many pieces of art there were. Hercules told her that this museum was built by him. He asked if she remembered the time when they opened the warehouse when they were doing the finance check. At that time, he was going to sell some surplus art to replenish the treasury. But there were a lot of things with high historical value and things that were too wasteful to sell. There were so many that they decided to display them here. Caroline noticed a vase and asked if it was stored in a national warehouse. The guy smiled and said it was the private property of an aristocrat. The original plan was to display only art from the castle, but the aristocrats insisted that they wanted to show off their riches too. They will charge them for space and charge visitors for admission. They will make a lot of money that way. Hercules looked at Carolina, who was looking at a certain thing with astonishment. This was not the reaction he expected. The Deviless came down to him quietly and told him it was so. Women were not interested in a man's bragging. The boy asked her not to appear so suddenly, but she smiled at him and said she was just giving him advice. The Deviless assumed that the girl could think like all humans, and it was as if she had not yet grown to love art. She suggested the boy use something simpler. Hercules hesitated. In that case, they went to the next place. The next landmark was a street market. He used to come here frequently. Passing by the various stalls, the girl was surprised at how lively the place was. They sold various baked goods, spices, and salt. She had never been to a place like this before. Even from the time when Lemuria was the capital of 2/3 of the world's wealth, there is still always plenty of various goods on the stalls here. In fact, since they had nothing to attract people, they decided to build a museum right next to the market. But on the other hand, this way they will attract people to go to the market and buy different goods. There are also artisans here, so they can even make a souvenir with your name and date on it. Carolina realized that this place had become so lively thanks to Hercules' Sama. The guy looked at the jewelry and tried one on Carolina. The girl looked at the necklace with surprise. Hercules said that her eyes are like rubies, or rather even more beautiful than them. Carolina smiled slightly and said he was flattering her. The guy asked her to tell him if she liked something, and he would buy it. Carolina waved her hands and said that was too much. The girl looked down in embarrassment, blushing. She said she didn't need anything. Ever since she was born into the Galednos family, her military father had only taught her things related to martial arts, all to protect Hercules herself. She was sure she wouldn't look good with any of those necklaces if Hercules gave it to her. The boy looked at her in surprise and assumed that she didn't need a reward from the emperor. The girl was confused, thinking that she didn't mean to hurt him with that. Hercules laughed and suggested that she just accept the necklace because he just wanted to give it to her. He talked about how Carolina was very pretty and that she would look good in anything. The girl turned away from him, blushing again, talking about how he was teasing her again. The boy smiled and agreed with her. Caroline took another look at the necklace. There were several pendants, and one of them caught her eye. The guy noticed she was looking at one and asked what she liked. Quickly turning away, the girl was about to leave, saying she didn't like anything. Hercules reflected that with all this in mind, he should not have shown her the aqueduct under construction. In that case, he figured out what he would do. They reached another noisy place where chariot races were being held. Caroline was just thrilled with what she saw. She had wanted to see chariot races for a long time. The boy was right that she would enjoy it as much as all the people. Chariot racing is a test of the bond of trust between the riders and the horse. Horse against horse and man against man in a heated battle of speed. Caroline was sure that there was no one who didn't enjoy it all. The red comet Xanadus Quadriga was especially cool. She told the hero that it was a popular jockey who had won many races since his debut. After stopping the horses, the jockey waved his hands to the audience. Caroline smiled and said that today's race was over. Then all the people who stood on top trumpeted, and the girl was surprised that her father came into the arena with a rag in his hands. The military man waved the handkerchief and threw it on the ground. After the signal, 2 horse-drawn wagons jumped out. The girl could not understand what was going on, and why from the beginning they had decided to have 2 races. After all, she thought about the fact that there was only 1 gate. The guy smiled and said they added the gates when they remodeled the stadium. This stadium had been struggling financially for a long time, and it was still suffering from lack of maintenance. So they decided to rebuild it with a new design. In the end, it was easier and cheaper to rebuild and renovate it. Carolina pointed her finger at Xanadus's red comet. Everyone shouted to him and asked him not to lose. The girl was just thrilled and couldn't believe she was seeing him live. Hercules looked at the girl and thought about how she didn't know all the things he had done yet. But seeing the girl's radiant and happy face, he was slightly embarrassed. Looking away, the boy smiled thoughtfully. Coming down the stairs, the girl was jumping for joy and exclaimed that it was great. She couldn't believe that the red comet had gone for it at the last minute. He had completely lived up to her expectations. And also Hercules reminded her that she had forgotten about him already halfway through the race. She felt embarrassed, and Caroline apologized by bowing to him. The hero knew it was getting late, but nevertheless offered to walk her to the last place. Caroline wondered what that place was. Hercules turned to her, saying that they were going to the sea, which made the girl stand in a stupor. The guy asked her what the problem was, saying it was a classic place for walking and dating. She had never heard of it. The sea is where the sewage of Lemuria ends. It's the worst place to go at all, which stinks, is dirty, and just plain disgusting. The guy thought about how these were really the kind of places they chose to date in another world. He told her it was okay, and pushing her forward offered to move on. Along the way, he assured her that everything was fine. Caroline covered her nose in anticipation of horror, so she wouldn't smell that odor, and Hercules said they had arrived. The girl opened her eyes. She saw before her a fabulous view from a height where the whole sea was visible. Carolina was amazed at such beauty. Going down to the sea, she noticed that there was absolutely no garbage and that the water was so clean and didn't stink. The harbor used to be full of fish waste, but now it was clean. Hercules smiled and said it was all thanks to the law. Until now, all of New Lemuria's sewage and garbage was dumped into the sea. That's why the harbor was very trashy and sometimes it caused epidemics. So he built a building to remedy this situation. Caroline asked what this building was, and Hercules told her that it was a sewage treatment plant. It is used to pass all the sewage in New Lemuria through a series of filters before releasing it into the sea. There is also now a law against littering. He was also going to create a new position that would be in charge of garbage collection and cleanup. And in order not to litter the area near the capital, he decided to dump the garbage somewhere far away from the capital. Caroline couldn't believe that he went to all this trouble and made up a law to clean up all the trash. She asked if it was really all that necessary, but the guy said he needed it all. As he approached Caroline, he gently put his arms around her neck and kissed her forehead. He smiled and told her that it was all necessary in order to go on a date with someone he liked. And in that case, it would be nice if the streets were clean. The girl touched her forehead and blushed. Hercules discreetly at the moment of kissing her put on the very pendant she was looking at. He told her that this blue stone looked good against her red hair. He thought about the fact that she liked that pendant then as he watched her. Hercules looked the girl in the eye and said that it suited her very well. Shocked Caroline was happy. She smiled at him and thanked him. The boy smiled and told her that he would like her to do it too. But Carolina did not understand him. He wanted her to kiss his cheek in gratitude, and Carolina blushed. After all, he had worked very hard until today. And thanks to his policies, the sea had become as beautiful as it was. Besides, Carolina said she would do whatever he asked. The girl was shocked. While she was embarrassed and blushing in front of him, Hercules thought about how he didn't want to ask for too much. Smiling, he wondered if it was too early for Caroline to ask to kiss him. But then Caroline put her hands on his shoulders and kissed his cheek, telling him that he had done a good job. She surprised the hero, but then he thanked her by taking the girl by the waist. They hugged, after which the guy pulled Caroline close to him, putting his hand on her head. A devilish flew past them, noticing that it was getting hot in here. Hercules cursed at her and mentally told the fucking devil to shut up. So they stood for a while, looking at the sea. Sitting at work, the patriarch said he had not seen His Majesty today. He was told that he had a date with Lady Caroline, which surprised the patriarch. Smiling, he thought it was nice to be interested in a girl. Caroline's father was uncomfortable when he said that. His Majesty, who at first showed no initiative in his duties and was idle, had worked very hard until today. So his uncle thought that it was normal, that now he just wanted to take some rest. After all, it wasn't long before the war could start. While they were sorting out papers and maps, Hercules showed the girl the beauties of nature. There was some suspicious activity on Person Island. There was no definite proof at the moment, but they couldn't leave things as they were. Something must be done before things took a problematic turn. Hercules' uncle and Caroline's father decided to discuss things with His Majesty. Christopher said he would go first, but the military man disagreed, calling him a smartass. With angry looks at each other, they opened the doors at the same time. They asked permission to take some of his time. A picture appeared before them of a guy lying on the lap of a blushing Caroline and reading a book. She hesitantly asked if he would be uncomfortable reading sitting down. Both were shocked, shrieking at His Majesty. Carolina was frightened when she saw her father. Unperturbed, Hercules put down his book and rested his head on Caroline's lap, saying that they would like to expand the troops. Kneeling before him, both agreed with him. Christopher said they should start with the naval troops, and they should have paid attention to the army to begin with. They looked at each other again with disapproval, and Hercules threw himself into Caroline's arms, saying that these old men were scaring him. But the jokes had to be put aside. Last year, they spent most of their increased profits on public enterprises: water irrigation, rebuilding military routes, running aqueducts, fixing public health, and so on. If they don't strengthen the backbone of the state, it will simply be impossible to expand the army. The morale of the population must be appropriate. But he planned at the very beginning to increase the military budget. Hercules planned all this, but there was one but. He sternly told them that the army of this country was too weak and incredibly disorganized to rebuild. Regardless of the difference of races bound by the peace treaty, they could just ignore it and start leisurely raising funds themselves. He realized that they had to strengthen the military troops, but the army is too weak. Christopher wanted to object, even though he said they noticed a strange movement in the outskirts. But Hercules assumed they were about the Personia Peninsula, which he was already aware of. Suspicious and unregistered transactions of the wheat and iron guilds had already been confirmed. On top of that, consumer merchants and middlemen everywhere were reporting an abnormal increase in the number of mercenaries that were coming to them. And when he traced the source of all these changes, he realized that they were all related to the Personia Peninsula. Hercules was sure that those guys from Personia thought that as long as the throne was occupied by some kid there, they could be defeated. But to him it was vain. They had no idea about personal conflicts. It was obvious that they would be attacked sooner or later. In fact, expanding this weak army would be a waste of money. Exhaling heavily, Hercules talked about how it was all very difficult. Caroline decided to intervene and suggested what would happen if Lemuria's army became stronger. Guy jumped to his feet and shouted to Galfes and Christopher that he would reward them, and ordered them to act immediately. He called a strategic conference. This is exactly what Galfes expected his daughter to do, and Christopher thought of it as simple. They had money left over after the financial reform. At this point, the army of the Lemurian Empire numbered about 20,000 heavy cavalry and longbow archers combined with about 100 warships. It was time to consider declaring war to seize lands lost under past rule. Hercules asked for a more precise answer to him as to how many reinforcements they needed. About this, Galfes would like to say that they have enough cavalry for now. But he did not feel calm for them either. At least 10,000 infantry. But if he could ask for more, 20,000 would be better. Hercules said not to ask him for more. They couldn't afford such a thing. Hercules asked what they had with the fleet. Christopher was satisfied with the state of the naval forces so far, but many ships were at their limit and would be worth rebuilding. In that case, if they cut back on the army's spending, their control over the sea would increase significantly. Or rather, they would retain their status. Galfes turned to the Majesty and said that they hadn't had a sea battle in almost 20 years. And now they urgently needed an army. His uncle resented his words. Christopher shouted to him that if they lost control of the sea, they wouldn't be able to defend the imperial capital. He insisted that a fleet was more necessary. Meanwhile, Galfes asked for the army to be reinforced. He was sure that there was no need to mess around with vermin. Their quarrel was not unreasonable because their troops really should be given a little more attention and money. The military troops of the Lemuria Empire were divided into two parts: the army led by Galfes and the navy commanded by Christopher. Originally, Lemuria had a standing army of 100,000 infantrymen. The cavalry was augmented by recruits or mercenaries from allied tribes. The main army was well trained and quickly adapted to any battlefield, which followed the impetus to direct the course of expansion of the Lemurian Empire's lands. But military strength declined after the collapse of the empire. When the previous Emperor Hadrian III reigned, its numbers were greatly reduced. It came out that he destroyed all the infantry and formed an army based on heavy cavalry and archers who were less flexible but effective in battle. He thought it was a wise decision to organize the army using these soldiers as a sensitive substitute for horse troops. During this period, the soldiers consisted of half peasants and half mercenaries from allied tribes. And as long as their army is made up of poorly equipped men who only yesterday held the plow, it is simply impossible to win. Hadrian III kept losing men, and until they had a chance to improve their capabilities, the number of lost battles kept growing. Money continued to be wasted from buying expensive horses and armor. Soon the empire of Lemuria was mired in financial problems. This is how the state of the state's finances came to its current dire straits. Caroline turned to Hercules and said that if composing the main army causes difficulties, why doesn't he involve mercenaries? Hercules replied that it would be difficult with mercenaries. Mercenaries were soldiers who lived for money. Even the Habsburgs of Spain, who owned colonies in South America and had made themselves rich with huge farms and silver mines, completely emptied the country's budget to keep the mercenary unit of Tertia. Because of this, and the lack of a regular army, some of them were betrayed and provided a sad experience. The Italian philosopher Niccolo was against an army of foreign mercenaries, for they could not be trusted. But Tertius went from a mercenary army to a regular army. They are different from the French reinforcements that betrayed Nicolas Machiavelli. However, one might as well give the example of a Swiss mercenary who fought for France until his death. Another example is the National Warriors of France, who took the side of the townspeople during the Revolution, so it is impossible to confirm the evil intentions of the mercenaries. The mercenaries put Niccolo through many hardships. Probably about a third of the kingdom's theories were constructed based on personal reasons. Machiavelli himself was not noted for his military qualities. Considering how weak their army was, hiring mercenaries would only add fuel to the fire. Hercules thought it was worth it to focus on strengthening the main army. Galfes agreed with him and said that they would not rely on mercenaries. Christopher stood up from his chair after Galfes said that most of the mercenaries in the fleet couldn't even ride a horse. Christopher exhaled and agreed that they had hoiki ships because they had been mistreated by the roughnecks in the army, so they would have to rebuild them. The two almost pounced on each other, barely able to contain themselves. Hercules told them that if they did not stop this immediately, he would make them both kiss each other, as an order from the emperor. The two men groaned and lowered their heads in silence. Hercules was pleased and called them good boys. Hercules said they were not denying the fleet. If they lost control, it would be hard to regain it. Signing the paper, the boy asked them to hurry up with building the ships. The uncle smiled and thanked Hercules. As for the army, he wouldn't be able to find 10,000 men for them, but about 3,000 he would be able to find. Galfes said that should be enough. The whole problem lay in the 30,000 troops of non-commissioned officers in the regular army. Galfes asked if that was exactly normal. But if there are only 30,000 soldiers, then yes, because there is always a certain number of junior officers assigned to inspect for mercenaries and recruits. Hercules smiled at Galfes and said that in that case he would leave it to him. Christopher offered to deal with the Personia boys, as they are a bit of a problem. The mercenary corps of Personia rebelled against their master, the Emperor, 8 years ago. They are the representatives who rebelled and plundered the Personian Peninsula. They knew that the ruler was too concerned with slow, heavy cavalry and would not be able to withstand light infantrymen. He was thinking of those using the same tactics. Carolina thought Hercules meant that they would invade their territory again. But more likely their scheme is to make the young emperor suffer and to steal the finances of the state, because they themselves are apparently in a state of financial poverty. Hercules had heard that the farmers of the Personia Peninsula were suffering from toxins. Christopher looked at Hercules and suggested something, and the hero agreed with him. It was already dark and deep night when in a neighboring kingdom a cloaked man walked into a room. 2 elven women bowed to him. The man squeezed the girl's shoulder with his large hand, and grinning said that they had nothing to fear, for he was the king of this place. The girl with tears in her eyes looked at the man in horror. He asked his subordinate how many soldiers they had already gathered, and the warrior told him that in addition to those 10,000 mercenaries, which included 5,000 infantrymen and 5,000 crossbowmen, they had gathered 30,000 infantrymen and 5,000 cavalry of various tribes. So they had a total of 45,000 soldiers. The king smiled and said that's not bad. Hercules looked at the papers and said that the commander of the mercenaries Personia here is only one. It was the Black Panther Dalios. Grinning, the dark-haired and scary king with a tail hugged the little frightened elf girl. It was a warm sunny day and the castle was quiet. Meanwhile, the patriarch was carrying a pile of scrolls in his hands. He decided to take a look at the courtyard from the balcony and saw something interesting. Caroline, along with Hercules, decided to practice fighting. In this fencing, they were more serious than ever, crossing swords with each other. Bringing Hercules a pile of papers, Christopher showed the hero the state of army formation and schedules of ship designs when the war would begin. Given the influx of wheat and iron in Personia, they would soon be on the move. They've also started gathering soldiers, and the enemies will definitely take a lot of time to prepare for war. Hercules said that their soldiers are well prepared, but they need to rebuild the ships and gather as many soldiers as they can. Hercules asked the underlings to make sure everything is well prepared. After the strategic military meeting, all the military and artisans of the Lemurian fortress were alerted, and they began their duties. A large warship was approaching the harbor port. A military man told Christopher that they had gathered all the galleys. The sailing ships were moving rather slowly, so it was necessary to sharpen the masts and speed them up. After all, in a real battle, the ship would be weighted down with armor and weapons. They needed to mobilize everything they could. Besides, the rowers on the starboard side were rowing too much harder than the others, and the ship might turn around. If they left it like that, it could hit allied ships. Christopher asked for these shortcomings to be dealt with more quickly. On the training ground, the warriors were preparing for battle. One of the men was thrown back by someone and fell right beside an ally. The man who did this screamed and asked them what had happened to them. He hoped they weren't scared, just that. The warrior told them not to even dream of defending the empire with powers like theirs. Their enemies were barbarians who had stolen their country's lands. He wondered how his allies could be afraid and retreat. He asked them to imagine that he himself was the general of the enemy army and demanded that they attack him with the intent to kill him. The man said he would not let anyone go home until they did. Before the war, to recover the lands lost to Personia, everyone put in a lot of hard work in preparation. To raise the soldiers' morale and strength, right now Hercules was training with Carolina with all his might. The hero expected exactly the same from a daughter from a family of honored knights. He couldn't find a single gap in her defense. Carolina was a supreme knight. Caroline was more serious than ever and tried to give Hercules a blow, which he dodged. Caroline said that his stunt would not lower her guard. After all, the knight always behaves calmly, and excitement could take her life. Hercules smiled and said that she was right. After all, she is the daughter of Gallegnos. Hercules came up with a plan and jumped off the building's canopy to Caroline. Preparing his sword to strike, he used his innate body enhancement magic. The girl was wary and prepared to fend off the blow, but her sword was broken in half by the impact. The guy wondered what she was going to do now. Caroline also used her innate magic of extreme speed. By sidestepping the hero's punch, she was able to get right up to his face, which surprised Hercules. The guy was confused. Grabbing him by his clothes from behind, she fell him to the ground and put a shard of the sword to his throat. Carolina sternly told him not to be so confident after breaking her sword. Hercules smiled and, recognizing the defacement, suggested that he should call it a day. He said he was no match for her. The girl glowed with joy and said that his majesty was also magnificent. She was sure that the hero had a talent for swordsmanship. Hercules only replied that he could do as much as any other man. He did not think he could be better. Caroline thought for a moment and said that if his majesty used the bond with the spirit he had a contract with, even she wouldn't be able to resist him. The elves had 3 unique abilities. They are sorcery, magic, and spirit art. Sorcery was a kind of gift that allowed one to deeply understand the world and interfere with its structure. It was in great demand in medicine, manufacturing, siege battles, and the like. It was through sorcery that sewage treatment plants could be built in such a short time. Magic may seem similar to sorcery, but its essence is quite different. Unlike sorcery, which is not meant for combat due to activation restrictions such as calculation and pronunciation, magic is purely used during battles without restrictions. However, no matter how much effort one puts into practicing and teaching, not everyone was compatible with magic. Magic could be categorized into 3 main parts. Innate magic, this is the magic you get from birth. For example, the extreme speed that Caroline possessed. This magic increases the speed of the body by several times. Ancestral magic, which can only be obtained through one's bloodline. The Galenos family and their unusual claim that their sword was created for the emperor fit into this category. Anything they pick up becomes a top-of-the-line weapon. Even an ordinary fork could pierce anything. Hereditary magic is a type of magic inherited from person to person. The emperor was a good example for this. Magic passed down from generation to generation by the emperors of Lemuria. It is the main sign of the emperor's successor. Using it, one can master psychological advantages over other elves. It played a huge role in the discussion of financial reform with the nobles. And finally, the spiritual art. This technique allowed one to contract with spirits for their assistance. Spirits represent power and nature, and through contractual bonding, a person could utilize their power in the spiritual arts. Anyone who signed a contract with a spirit could do so, so there are many values. In the countryside, spirits were often found to be able to predict the weather. But since a contract was being made, the spirits of course had to be paid for their work. The downside is that every time you use the spirit's power, you have to repay it. In Hercules' contract, on the other hand, the condition is the source of magic power, and his spirit wouldn't be much help in battle. But the guy grinned and said that it didn't matter, because he felt relieved that Carolina wasn't hurt. Carolina looked at the hero's smirk in surprise. Hercules held out his hand to her and motioned for her to return to the room, asking her to help him stand up. But after he grabbed Caroline's hand, he immediately pulled her to him, catching the girl off guard. He smirked and asked Carolina if this was a good time to use extreme speed. But she said that if she used that skill now, his majesty would just be blown away, and asked if that was really what he wanted. The hero decided to taunt her, noticing that Caroline was still trying to act calm. He lowered himself even closer to her, saying that his arms were tired. Caroline wailed for his majesty to stop doing that. The hero smiled, and fixing Caroline's hair said that she was very easy to embarrass. Carolina covered her eyes, and at that moment, the guy looked at the pendant around her neck that fell on her hair. He thought about the fact that the girl was still wearing the pendant he had given her. Grabbing her hand, Hercules slowly reached for her lips, while Caroline still lay with her eyes closed. But then the whole moment was spoiled by the patriarch, who, smiling and standing at the top of the balcony, said that this is what carefree youth looks like. Caroline was frightened, but Hercules only angrily asked what he wanted from him. The patriarch smiled and apologized. He told his majesty that Titus had called him. Hercules was surprised to be called by his older brother. Meanwhile, Titus was working in the workshop and was angry that he had been waiting for his little brother for a whole 10 minutes. 10 whole precious minutes he had spent waiting for him. He thought about how problematic this was, and that his majesty could have shown a little more respect to his own older brother. After Hercules came to Titus, he had to listen to his brother's indignation. He was resentful, for he couldn't concentrate at work when he was expecting someone. However, Hercules' indifference to waiting people could not be changed. While he was creating masterpieces, people like him, who were not immersed in art, were only flirting with girls. And those 10 minutes are very valuable to the person waiting, but he doesn't care. Titus thought it a huge mistake if his brother thought of him working the same way as all humans. Hercules told him that in that case, he would reserve a good place for his next exhibition. It was as if Titus had been switched. He put his hands on Hercules' shoulders and said that His Majesty is a very powerful man. He is his dear and little brother. Hercules could not believe that such a simpleton really existed in their world. Titus asked him to sit down while he made him some coffee. After stopping Hercules, he asked him not to sit on just one chair, which he said was unique. It was called the cursed chair. It was the favorite chair of a man who was executed for serial murder. And as soon as he sat on it, the man's undead spirit would kill him. At least that's what he was told. That chair had caused the deaths of over 50 people. Titus found it horrifying. Hercules assumed it was Busby's chair. Hercules suggested that if that was the case, the chair should be made to hang from the ceiling when on display, and Titus agreed to his idea. Titus was the second son of the Hadrian family, his older brother and the second prince of the Lemurian Empire. He didn't feel any brotherly bond. After all, they were half-brothers and grew up separately. But their views on art coincided, so they often talked, even though Hercules was just an amateur. Even though the younger brother ascended to the throne, their relationship did not change. Hercules asked Titus to listen to him. He asked his brother how His Majesty Hadrian was doing. Titus said that he had not yet gone out into the world. He thought about the fact that Hadrian still could not accept the fact that he was not the one who got the crown. Hercules thought about just giving the crown away, but Titus smilingly advised him against it. After all, if he gave the crown away, the kingdom would be over. Hercules asked Titus if he wanted the crown, and Titus said no. He asked His Majesty not to joke like that. He created a place for exhibitions, which was called the Art Gallery Museum. He also discovered coffee, which gave him a cheerful state of mind for a few hours. It's not like he just didn't have time to be emperor. After all, when Titus was done with the sculpture, he had a few paintings to do, and after that, he still had to do the set for next month's concert. He had so much inspiration, but not enough hands. He already had the crazy idea to clone himself. The hero grinned and said that his brother was just like Huizon. Titus asked him who that was, but Hercules told him not to take it into his head, just thinking out loud. Hercules was actually hoping for Hadrian to take the throne. Before they distanced themselves from each other, he wished him a good day, after which he gave him an angry look at the hero. Hercules was certain that Hadrian hated him. Pouring coffee, Titus said that it was just that he couldn't handle the problem. He was his father's first child, and then his upbringing was not successful. And even if he does care, this problem can't be solved anymore. He still has 2 older brothers. Hercules took a mug of coffee from his brother. The second son of the family is Titus, and the third was Hadrian. As one might have already guessed, Hadrian was named after his father. And if he came to the throne, he would be called Hadrian IV. The father wanted to make his first child his heir. Perhaps this name was given to him with the hope of realizing his father's dreams. However, the father was wrong in his way of love. The father spoiled Hadrian, and he became selfish and turned away from society. As far as Titus was concerned, he did not use his powers for good. He attacked and brutally dealt with the neighborhood children of aristocrats. And each time, his father bowed to the victims and their families to hush up the incident. It was also his child could inherit the title of emperor. A long time ago, he smashed up a painting of Titus. Hercules was surprised, for he had never heard of such a thing. He assumed that they had quarreled afterwards. Titus said he argued with his father when he told him he shouldn't have painted in front of Hadrian. He learned a new term that day, groundlessness. With these words, Hercules thought of his brother looking like a corpse. Yet it was his father who was to blame for his character. Titus thought that he just hoped it would go away with time. But it didn't. 14 years ago, he attacked 4 noble children. Because of that incident, the whole empire was shaken up. Hadrian was calm, thinking that his father would think of something, but it did not happen. Eventually, his father turned his back on him and gave up. Titus wanted to point out that his father was a very determined man. After that incident, he approached Titus himself for the first time. He asked him about his progress and looked at his scribbles, but he spoke of how apparently he was useless too and never came to him again. Hercules thought that after that Titus began to hate his father. The first son is as useless as the second. Hostilities were unfolding, the political situation was also unclear. And when the father was cornered, another son was born. This was Hercules. He was born at the perfect time, and what's more, from his childhood he handled everything splendidly. To his father, he was a real miracle. From then on, all his love was given to him alone, and completely forgot about Hadrian. That's why Hadrian hated him. Titus smiled nonchalantly and said it was a happy ending. Hercules was shocked by his carefree attitude and asked what was so happy about it. It was the opposite of problematic. On top of that, the father was terrible at parenting. Titus said that wasn't true, because Hercules was the result of his success. He avoided all the mistakes made with his first and second sons. The heirs of royal families are true creations, achieved by the bitter experience of previously born children. If a masterpiece was born from the beginning, no one would have to suffer. Also, Hercules was able to build such social infrastructure as a sewer cleaner. The hero sipped from his mug and sullenly thanked him for these words. Titus asked his majesty when he would finally get rid of Hadrian, since no one knows when his power-hungry older brother will behead him. But Hercules was not going to do that. As long as he behaves calmly and quietly, he will not touch him. But Titus didn't believe that their brother would stand idly by. Wouldn't it be a problem if he got involved with the non-elven aristocracy? Hercules gloomily looked at his brother and said that Titus was completely ignorant of politics. It was inconceivable that they would revolt. The movement of goods and people could be tracked through the guilds. An attack is just as impossible. No assassin could get through Caroline's guards. And if he does go on a killing spree, he could easily be arrested or killed for a multitude of reasons. Titus excitedly said that his brother was saying frightening things. Hercules remembered something when he mentioned Carolina and asked Titus if the thing he asked him for was finished. Titus looked at the suitcase that was lying off to the side and said with a smile that it was the very thing he had called him for. Hercules opened the suitcase and looked at the thing. Hercules showed a red blush of happiness and said that this was exactly what he expected from him, saying that the thing was perfect. The brother was happy to hear this. Hercules wondered where Titus had gotten such a design. Titus said he had done exactly as Hercules had asked, and asked if everything was okay. Hercules agreed with him and said it looked cool. Titus thought that Hercules was going to give it to Miss Caroline when the military reform was successful. After all, the hero had talked about not being able to do that until the outcome was clear. Hercules closed the suitcase and smiled, realizing what his brother was talking about. But no sooner had he answered him than there was a knock at the door. Christopher came in to apologize to the prince and his majesty. He told Hercules that the training of 30,000 infantry and junior officers had been completed. The fleet had also been rebuilt, and the maximum number of ships on the move had been reached. Titus guessed what that meant, and Hercules smiled. Hercules told them that they would retake the Personia Peninsula, and from that moment the war begins. The territory of Personia is a land based on the territory of the Empire of Lemuria. Their main income came from exporting products such as grapes, olives, and marble. But it was obviously not enough to employ roughly 10,000 mercenaries. 8 years ago, Hercules was 4 years old. The mercenary had broken in because his predecessor Hadrian III had stopped paying the money agreed upon in his contract with the mercenaries. To quell the rebellion, he took command of the troops and started a war, but he was defeated by an army under Dalios. Eventually peace was established, but they had to sacrifice the peninsula of Personia. Since then, the Personia Peninsula has functioned as a state in a state of de facto and ruled by mercenaries. They stole, dominated, oppressed, and coerced, thanking the tyrant Dalios. At night at Personia Bay, the sea was calm and glistened in the moonlight. This night the lad was drinking in the inn, admiring the beautiful night, but here all the tranquility was disturbed by some noise coming from the windows. He heard the sounds of cannons and people fleeing into town from the coast. The military watchman of the tower ordered everyone to go to their places and make quick preparations. The whole horizon of the sea was in enemy ships that were coming towards the city. In the city, desperate people sat against the walls of a building with their heads down. A soldier passed by and a child tried to hold on to him. He asked the soldier to spare them, but the soldier only silently hit the boy on the head. Meanwhile, in the enemy's castle, a royal dinner was being held. Freshly cooked meat was on the table. The king looked at the notes his maids had brought. He was asked to lower taxes, for this country is full of poor people. Even though he freed them from Lemuria's control, they ended up wasting all the money. The king thought about what they would even do without him, and after throwing away the leaf, he picked up a wine glass and sipped. Putting the glass on the table, he smirked and said that at least the wine was good here. And the food is also better than Lemuria's. A clerk approached the commander and said that they had detected movement from the Lemurian Empire. They were probably preparing for an invasion. The king only smiled and said that he was aware of it. The man asked the commander if he was really going to attack Lemuria, but the commander said they had nothing to fear. Their enemy was a 15-year-old kid who had never experienced war. Moreover, he was the offspring of Hadrian III. He was sure that the son had taken after his father, in which case he would only go to pray to the gods or something similar. After all, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. The commander smiled wryly and, clutching his glass tighter, offered to make his first war memorable. A soldier burst into the room and said they had bad news. With these words, the commander grabbed the soldier by the head and slammed his head right against the table. He was furious that the soldier had distracted him, and now he would not be able to eat in peace. The soldier who smashed the plate with his face said he was sorry. Still, he told the commander that they had received a letter that the Empire's army had entered their territory. The two maids looked at each other in horror, and the commander looked at the soldier with some surprise. At some point, he snapped out of his seat and swept everything off the table in a rage and shouted about what was happening here. They decided to attack unexpectedly, but the commander had already realized this and asked the soldier where the invasion started from. Then the commander was suddenly told that Personia Bay had fallen under the onslaught of the Lemurian Empire's army. As if maddened, the commander broke out in a gloating smile. He called Hercules nothing but a little rat. He realized that Hercules knew that Personia had no ships. The fact that they were preparing to attack from the land turned out badly for them. If they had any ships, they would have held them off until the troops landed. The commander ordered the soldiers to be summoned more quickly in such a case. If they are now in Personia Bay, they can go to two places, either to the fortress where he is or to the capital. The commander was in the fortress, but now they would have to travel quite a long way to get here. Walking long distances in heavy armor would only lower the physical strength of the soldiers. And since he's thinking more about strategy than Hadrian III, he probably won't make such a stupid move in a surprise attack. And if Hercules wants to stay on the plus side, he will head for the capital. Still, the commander smiled and thought about the fact that they were being naive. 1,000 mercenary infantry raised in such conditions since childhood, and a grand total of 20 archers so reigned here. On top of that, they were enclosed by a high wall. It wouldn't fall so easily. He figured they needed to counterattack them in front of the wall, and when they slowed down, then it would be over. In that case, not even much damage would be done. But while the commander was pondering this, a soldier ran up that told him that the capital wall had been destroyed and the army had broken through. The commander couldn't believe his words, for his military training was perfect. Lemuria was not supposed to have such a strong army, but it all coincided with a riot in the capital, something the commander had not considered. He could not believe how a riot could even happen at such a time. He looked at the map in horror and thought about the fact that there were traitors among them. It was too noisy in the city at this time. People were rioting and attacking the servants. People were shouting at them to get out of here and flee this country. They didn't want to be killed by taxes while they were enjoying delicious food for their money. The soldiers and their commander asked the people to stop this pathetic resistance. They could not continue to let the imperial army continue to successfully crush them. The people demanded that the soldiers shut up. They would rather give these lands to Lemuria than live like this. They demanded the soldiers to get out of here. The angry commander ordered the soldiers to quiet the people. One of the soldiers drew his sword and stabbed the rioter standing directly in front of him. He stabbed him several times before he fell down. Another soldier ordered all the castle gates to be opened for the imperial army to enter. Looking at the city and everything that was happening from afar, Hercules grinned and was willing to bet that the panther said something like an apple that didn't fall far from another. He wondered what it would be like for him to have an apple pressed against your tail. While the emperor was rejoicing, his handmaiden noticed that Hercules was apparently very proud of himself. Caroline, that stood behind, asked him how come this invasion went so smoothly, but for Hercules everything was very simple. He gestured something like money. Dalios hired mercenaries who had been raised in such conditions since childhood. These guys are very loyal to him, so if he tried to defeat them, they would take revenge. But there weren't enough loyal mercenaries to defend the cities. So Dalios hired some more mercenaries from abroad. So first they lured them to their side by paying twice as much. He was aware of his intentions as early as 3 months ago. Dalios looked at his majesty sullenly and said he was a bribe taker. Who else could speak of loyalty? But he did say that mercenaries should not be trusted. And when he sent some bribed mercenaries into the city, he started a riot among the townspeople with their help. Caroline looked at Christopher and wondered how they were even able to do something like that, relying on the townspeople. They had been fed up with Dalios' tyranny from the beginning. Their irritation was growing by the day. It would be possible to start a rebellion with the help of those loyal mercenaries, but it would take quite a while to win them over to their side, and now they were already opening the gates. In any case, the success of this invasion had been clear 3 months earlier. Hercules was now confident that they could meet Dalios on a better battlefield. He looked at Caroline's father, who apparently had something to say to him. He told the Majesty that this was the first time he was taking command of the war. Up to this point, his orders had been flawless, but this success was like a miracle. And he thought about the fact that now they should defend this favorable position for as long as they could hold it. Hercules chuckled at the fact that a general of the imperial army was suggesting to resort to defense, also right in front of his daughter. To him, he was acting like a weakling. The general looked angrily at the emperor, but the emperor only said that they had a good chance of winning. The Personia Peninsula was the territory of the empire until the last 8 years. Based on the information he got from the merchants, all he could say was that its geography hadn't changed much. But the general was doubtful and said that they could have been bribed by Dalios. Hercules smilingly told him that he was very careful and handed him a wrapped paper. Hercules said it was a map of the Personia Peninsula. He found it when he fell asleep in the castle library. After comparing it with the traitors' information, everything almost matched. He pointed his finger at the map and said that the day after tomorrow, Dalios would attack this town to retake it. He suggested starting the attack with archers, using the hill as a base. There was a river flowing on the other side of the hill, so they would only need to defend the front and rear. Hercules asked to give the soldiers time to dig trenches and defend themselves. This would be enough to compensate for the lack of soldiers. Hercules asked the general to calm down, saying that he was not like his father. When he was 4 years old, his father brought him to the battlefield for the first time. Even then, he was wearing heavy armor. After losing many battles, he learned many ways to escape, and eavesdropped on his and his father's conflicts. Dalios is terrible at ruling a country, but his record is 2 consecutive victories over the empire. Hercules could not win by his own hands alone. He smiled at the general and said he would listen to their opinions and choose a strategy by discussing everything with them. He offered to see their victory together. Without thinking long, the general knelt down and bowed to the hero, saying that he had grown a lot. He asked his majesty to leave the victory of this war to him. He promised to deliver it to his majesty, whatever it cost him. Hercules smiled at Galfes and said he was counting on him. After all, he is Galfes, the raging fire. The general smiled at the emperor and said he understood him. Sitting in the middle of the deep night in a dark room, the lad thought about the surprise attack in the bay and capturing the capital. Just like Galfes said, everything was going as planned. Dalios must have indulged in panic these few days. During this time, they would have to finalize their preparations. Christopher was also busy defending the bay. The war would begin in 2 days. Their army, doubled in size, would be at a premium. While Hercules was thinking it over, a Deviless came down on top of him. She saw that the guy did not sleep and asked in that case to help him. But Hercules did not take his eyes off the view from the window and said that he did not need help. In the streets of the city, the footsteps of many soldiers were heard. General Panther ordered them to move faster. He was no longer going to dance to the tune of Lemuria. Gritting their teeth, Hercules and Panther thought of one thing. They both underestimated each other. An enraged Dalios said something about killing Hercules. Hercules was looking out the window thinking about what move Dalios would make, ignoring the fact that the Deviless hugged him from behind. The rule of triple attack said that the attacking side needed 3 times as many men to defeat the defending enemies. The rule said that it was better to defend than to attack. However, the attacking side has a much greater choice of location and timing of their attack than the defending side. The implication is that it can be said that it is easier for the attacking side to take the initiative of war than for the defending side. Hercules believed that they would strategically attack and tactfully defend and win. That's roughly what their fight would look like. Carolina didn't understand when she asked him if the enemies would then take the initiative. But the truth is that both sides, both defending and attacking, can take the initiative on the battlefield. Hercules smiled and said that it was impossible to say for sure about them because they neither defend nor attack, but he would easily let them attack. Apparently, Dallio's management has made the townspeople hate him. Accordingly, his weakness is that he dominates everyone at the expense of fear. When the mercenaries realize that the war is a losing one for them and no one will help them, they will flee to the desert. Caroline asks Hercules why they would do that. Wouldn't it be easier for the soldiers to rally around their leader? But Hercules reminded her that war is a business. They couldn't be loyal enough to someone to commit themselves to war without a chance of winning. After all, they couldn't be trusted. After all, money decided everything. Caroline puffed up her cheeks and the boy stroked her head. He said that an oath to one's country and the desire to give one's life for it was fundamentally different from an army of such soldiers. He thought about the fact that Dalios wanted to defeat him as soon as he could, and he didn't care how disrespected his position was. Therefore, he felt that they needed to tease him. A beast with big eyes announced to Hercules and Caroline that enemy soldiers had been detected. An army of soldiers was advancing on them from the front. The entire field was covered with 40,000 soldiers. The time of the decisive battle had arrived. The soldiers looked at the field and talked about how those damn traitors had finally appeared. The general pointed his finger at the flag that had a black panther on it. Hercules also saw it. The intimidating General Dalios led the army and rode ahead on horseback. The front line consisted of 28,000 mercenaries from across the border. Their flanks consisted of about 5,000 light cavalrymen of various races. And finally, the rear was covered by 4,000 well-trained infantrymen and a crossbowman group of 3,000 riflemen. Hercules realized that the information completely matched what he had learned from the bribed mercenaries. In total, they had a cavalry of 8,000 soldiers, 15,000 infantry, and 5,000 longbow archers. Total 28,000 soldiers. All of their soldiers and numbers barely equaled their infantry, but they did have an upside to this defense. They were stakes and trenches. If they went straight across the river, they would obviously be pelted with arrows like raindrops in a storm. Dalios would try to rush in. Hercules didn't think about the fact that he had many options other than just going straight through. But if that happens, it will all depend on the actual strength of their opponents. Hercules addressed everyone and said that today would be a new page in the history of Lemuria. After this battle, their empire would be reborn. He shouted to everyone that they would take back their territory Personia, and the soldiers cheered him on. Panther looked angrily at Hercules from afar. Taking out his sword and raising it above him, he said he would make the hero regret it. He lowered the sword in front of him, and all the warriors threw themselves into the attack. The warriors of Hercules shouted to the others that they were being attacked. Hercules shouted to the archers, and they began to aim at the enemies. After which arrows rained down on the enemies. Those who could use summoning magic summoned the spirits of Vert and asked them to dance in the middle of the arrows. Many large butterflies appeared at the same time. They flew together with the arrows at the enemies, whereupon the arrows pierced the enemies to death. Dalios was not surprised. He only saw the same actions. They used the spirits for defense to attack from afar themselves. Elves were famous for their shooting abilities, so they could easily fire 10 arrows in a minute. As far as could be seen, they had about 5,000 archers. This meant that 50,000 arrows would fall on them every minute. Dalios thought about the fact that compared to their archers, the enemy ones were worse at penetrating armor. But if 1,000 arrows are aimed at the face or an exposed part of the body, it's different. 500 in a minute, 1,000 in 2 minutes. And in 10 minutes, 5,000 soldiers are dead or incapacitated, even without critical wounds. The arrows kept raining down on the enemies. This should have been enough to break their morale. Soldiers were begging for help, some retreating with an ally on their shoulder. They didn't want to die like this. The soldier being carried by his comrade was hit by arrows, and then he had to leave him behind. On their way to retreat, the soldiers ran into their general, who was angry that they were weak and ready to surrender. He asked the soldiers what the hell they were doing. In a rage, Dalios told them that he would not let his money go to waste. The soldiers were simply terrified, but they had no choice but to attack the enemy again. Hercules understood and said that those who ran at them would be killed one way or another. But they held on better than he thought, and thus could reach their archers. Hercules thought the time had come and called for Galfes. Galfes seemed simply huge in his armor. Going out to his majesty, he spoke of his time to fight had come. Hercules pointed his finger at the soldiers and asked him to take command of the heavy cavalry unit and head over there. The soldiers were surprised at the order and asked him to wait. After all, because of the armor of the heavy cavalrymen, it would be almost impossible to get over the trenches. Any way you look at it, it was an impossible move. But Galfes understood what His Majesty was saying and agreed with him. Hercules asked Galfes, who got on his horse, what distance would suit them. He answered the hero that 10 meters would be enough, and Hercules asked him if he was sure of this. Galfes smiled and asked who he thought he was. Taking a huge spear, Galfes shouted to the soldiers to follow him. He ordered them to keep going, no matter what. He asked them to show their enemies the result of all their training. They would spread the victory song throughout Lemuria. Galfes turned to Caroline, who was also riding behind him on horseback, and asked her to keep behind him as support from the rear. Caroline told her father that she understood. The general shouted to the archers to fall back, for the cavalry was already advancing. Meanwhile, Hercules was counting their distance from the enemy. The enemies, led by the general, were perplexed as to whether they were serious. They were planning to break through the trenches. Dalios was sure they were overestimating their horses and armor. But then he ordered them to halt and recall the soldiers now. When the distance reached the 10 mark, Hercules shouted for them to act now. He ordered the spirit of Asmodia, the Deviless, to cancel the illusion. The Deviless obeyed her master and canceled the illusion. Immediately, the barrier between the opponents disappeared, taking the enemy soldiers by surprise. Galfes shouted to Caroline that His Majesty had removed the illusion technique, and the girl understood him. The daughter and father shouted about tearing them to pieces and burning everything with just a single voice. They summoned the spirit of Oligos and the spirit of Ammon. The spirits that appeared began to sweep away everything in their path. They broke right into the middle of the enemy army. Caroline and the spirit killed the warriors that got in their way. Hercules shouted to them to go forward. The cavalry easily demolished the infantry soldiers that got in their way. Caroline shouted to the troop to march forward only. Dalios grudgingly said that they couldn't make it that way. Who would have thought that Hercules would be able to hide his offensive routes so well with the technology he had invented? He found it hard to believe that he was the son of such a fool. He didn't understand how a hawk could be born from a serpent. Grinning, Dalios was sure this was going to be fun. He turned to the sergeant and commanded a change of strategy. That's when all the infantrymen started scattering to the sides. The cavalry and soldiers didn't realize what they were doing. Hercules also realized that they stopped resisting and split up. Hercules seemed to begin to understand something about these actions. Caroline shouted to her father that the enemy's behavior had changed, but he told her that he had noticed it and ordered her not to let her guard down. The enemy's arrows landed directly on the heads of the allies, at which the father and daughter looked back in horror. The warriors began to fall from their horses. The enemy soldiers cooperated and put forward a squad of crossbowmen. Hercules looked at the enemy army with surprise. General Dalios pointed his sword at the enemy and ordered the crossbow unit to attack. He shouted to all the soldiers to march forward. Countless soldiers formed a line and put out their spears. The cavalry ordered no one to stop and move forward. Arrows began to fall into the horses, after which the riders fell with the horses. When the cavalry approached the enemies, they put out their spears to pierce them, thus creating a line of defense. Hercules' archers again prepared to attack, shouting to the enemies that they would not pass. But the enemies came closer and closer, and the soldiers shot the enemies almost point blank. Carolina was frightened, and Galfes noticed that their cause was not good. They were beginning to be driven back. Hercules was told that the first and third units had broken through. The infantry tried to handle the situation, but they couldn't hold off the enemies for long. A soldier begged Hercules to give the order to retreat, but Hercules remained silent. Hercules realized that Dalios wanted to destroy them with heavy cavalry. He divided the central infantrymen and sent them in different directions. He then dispatched crossbowmen and spearmen, thus making it difficult for their cavalry, which was already exhausted by the constant maneuvering, to move. In addition, by doing so, they blocked them with a wall of spearmen. Even if they could contain their spearmen and crossbowmen, if they used light cavalry, it would cover their flanks and regrouped infantry. Then they would be trapped. Hercules looked carefully at the enemy army. General Dalios smirked, for he was sure that Hercules had no backup plan. The soldier didn't understand what Hercules was talking about and why he was acting like that at this moment. It was at this very moment that he saw Hercules smiling as if he was pleased with himself. Hercules said in a low voice that Dalios had thought things through quite well. The hero smiled and asked the colonel to bring his horse, for he was sure that he was the winner of this battle. Caroline, meanwhile, was fending off the enemies from herself. She noticed the fact that her horse was as tired as she was. She had to find a way to defeat her enemies, for their cause was bad, but her father was counting on her. While she was contemplating her actions, her horse was shot by a crossbowman, whereupon she fell to the ground. Before she could get up, the point of a spear flashed before her eyes. It was 2 spearmen that were ready to pierce her. The girl cursed, and a soldier asked another how much they would get for the head of the enemy commander. But the other soldier could not understand what he was talking about, for he had a child in front of him. Another spearman objected, saying that she was the daughter of the famous Galfes of racing fire. He was willing to bet that they would make a lot of money, considering it was a famous night. They offered to auction her off at a slave auction and decided to go to the commander. But immediately one of the spearmen's head flew off. Caroline said it was too frivolous to discuss such a thing. She couldn't let any of them spoil His Majesty's plans. With these words, she went on the attack. Meanwhile, Hercules got on his war horse and gave the command to the soldiers to follow him. The entire army, led by Hercules, rushed down the hill at the enemy. Dalios grinned and assumed that they had all decided to go to certain death with their precious army. However, Lemuria only had about 10,000 soldiers and no more. But even if there were a bit more, Dalios was sure that nothing would change from that. But they turned out to be much more. The entire field was dotted with warriors that appeared on the horizon. General Dalios looked at the enemy army in horror, perplexed as to where such numbers came from. The enemy infantrymen were terrified, for they didn't think it would be like this. Another soldier shouted that they didn't sign up for this. They didn't want this for any money, so they decided to get out of here. Ignoring Dalios, who was yelling at them, the soldiers rushed as far away as they could. Pantera ordered the soldiers to return to their positions, saying that it was the spirit of illusion. But no one heard him anymore. Gritting his teeth, the general cursed, still unable to believe that Lemuria had so many warriors. Caroline also noticed that the enemies were beginning to retreat. As she watched the fleeing soldiers, a voice called out to her. It was Hercules, who held out his hand to her and asked her to grasp it. Grasping her hand, he pulled her close to him. As they hugged, Caroline said she was sorry, but Hercules said it was okay, and that she had fought well for her first battle. Sitting in front of His Majesty, she asked him to ask her something. She didn't understand why he was hiding how many warriors they had. She thought about the fact that their outcome of the battle might have been different if they had initially fought at full strength. But Hercules only glanced at the cavalry, and with a smile suggested that they might have been bribed mercenaries. But this proved to be only an illusion, which began to fade away. Carolina realized that it was an illusion. The Devilish hovered over the guy's soul and said that an illusion like this would require a proper reward. Hercules grudgingly told her that he knew about it and asked her to disappear. In reply, the spirit of the Devilish smiled and said that in that case it would come for him later. Hercules told Caroline that it is hard to destroy 40,000 warriors one at a time. Once the enemy loses the will to fight, victory was already in their pocket. Dalios would not be able to organize a competent defense after such a rout, and the outcome of the battle was already obvious. He shouted to Galfes that it was time to retreat and return to base, but it was as if Galfes had been replaced. He turned to Hercules and intimidatingly spoke of trusting Caroline and the soldiers to him. He wanted to stay here for a while and finish his business. Hercules understood him and asked to make sure in such a case that there was no tail behind them. He asked the general not to overdo it, and he promised to try. And so the first war under Hercules as emperor of the Lemurian Empire ended, and this war was ended with complete victory. After the heavy battle, Hercules' army began to clean up and put the weapons into boxes. It was also necessary to remove the bodies of the dead and deal with the injured. Hercules, meanwhile, was writing his report when he was called out by Galfes. Pulling open the entrance to the camp, he told the hero that they had brought him in. Hercules thought about the fact that the enemy general would behave differently and resist, but surprisingly he was quiet. But the Panther said about the fact that after such a crushing defeat, the remaining soldiers would not follow him. Unfortunately, they were not bound by either authority or bloodline. The general looked bloodthirstily at His Majesty and told him that he had completely underestimated him. It was a complete rout. He asked to be allowed to take the blame for this rudeness. Galfes couldn't understand how he dared to speak so arrogantly while bound. But Hercules smiled and said that this time victory was his. But he asked Dalios what he thought about if it had been a direct clash on the plain. Then Dalios would have won, which he answered. Galfes looked at Hercules shocked, not realizing what he was saying. Hercules laughed and said he agreed with the panther. Having had his first fight with Dalios, he had learned a lot. He realized that he had just surpassed his predecessor. He harkened back to the fact that Dalius had admitted his guilt and wanted to hear the terms of the peace treaty. The general said that His Highness would get all the lands, but in return, he asked for the lives of his close subordinates, whom he had raised since they were small children, to be spared. Galfes was shocked by his words. Galfes called him a bastard and asked him to imagine how much havoc they would cause if they left them behind. The general said that in that case they could deport them. Only they followed the panther to the last. With the rest of the troops and him, they could do whatever they wanted. He offered to hand them over to the mob or personally avenge the previous emperor. He asked them to do whatever they wished. Galfes thought it over and agreed to spare the lives of his subordinates. Galfes wanted to oppose his decision, but the hero had one condition. It was impossible to assess the damage they brought to the empire as well as its national prestige. And a bunch of heads of his subordinates wouldn't pay it off. Even his head being turned into a ball by 10 million inhabitants wouldn't be able to recoup it all. In that case, the panther asked Hercules what he wanted to do to him. Hercules smirked and said that he would become his vassal. Everyone looked at him in shock. Caroline and her father were just horrified. Galfes asked the hero flashly what he was saying. The panther laughed and said that the one was really unusual, but he didn't expect it to be that unusual. Ironically, he recalled that Hercules wanted to make a vassal of the man who had sealed his father's disgrace into history. Hercules smiled and asked if it was really so unusual. His predecessor had done nothing but lose. Now Lemuria didn't have even a shred of its former power. So he thought about it and decided to get an experienced warrior for his personal use. Besides, the problem was that at the moment, Galfes was the only experienced warlord he could trust with a 10,000-man squad. Their army was losing out to mercenaries in skill, so he would like to adopt some skills. In addition, he was going to pay them the reward that his predecessor had pocketed. The general turned his back on him and said that he shouldn't have been amused by such a thing because he was a mercenary. He could have put an arrow in his back, but Hercules was serious. Panther asked what would happen if he refused. Hercules laughed so loudly that he puzzled everyone. After all, he had just offered him a great place in the sun, but he was so disgusted by the thought of becoming someone's chain dog. Hercules had it all figured out. He interrogated Dalios about what he said about the arrow in his back. He asked something of the panther general. It was as if he had been switched. With a scary, threatening look, the guy asked Dalios who he was talking to now. The general's heart jumped up to his throat. Even Caroline and Galfes tensed up at his behavior. Dalios couldn't understand what was happening and where such unimaginable magical power came from. He couldn't breathe and couldn't understand how such a brat could have so much magic power. He used his spell on the panther. Even Carolina felt sick and began to be swept to the side. Catching the girl, it was as if Hercules was himself again and apologized. He knelt down with her, holding her by the shoulders. Galfes also became heavy, so much so that he leaned his hands on the table. The general fell on his ass and looked at Hercules in bewilderment. The hero had told him that he was not going to expel his subordinates from the country. He was going to find a suitable land somewhere and settle them there. Their possessions had fallen into disrepair, so it would take a lifetime to cultivate the land. The fellow smiled slyly and asked the captive if he understood what it all meant. The general understood it all. He understood what it was all about. The moment he decided to attack him, it was already on his neck. Hercules walked up to the general and put his hands on his shoulders. He smiled carelessly at him and said that he counted on their cooperation. News of the war and the capture of Personia reached the city. Everyone could not believe that such a thing was possible. The people that were in the castle were running through the corridors and demanding to start preparations for the banquet, and all to announce this news to everyone. Breathing heavily, Hercules' older brother broke a vase of flowers. Kneeling before him, the man told the majesty that if he raged, he might be heard. He clutched his clothes with his hands, not believing that such a small country could win. Hadrian said in a rage that he was far better suited to be emperor than his brother. The whole city welcomed its emperor. Everyone was happy and eagerly awaited the appearance of Hercules at the entrance of the city. It was the triumphant return of the hero. To the rolling fruition of fruition, the brave warriors threw battle cries. Everyone shouted for glory to the emperor. This was the victor's reward. Karistopher and Galfes were overjoyed at the applause. Caroline and Hercules also waved to the people as a greeting. The patriarch and others were already smiling and waiting for his majesty. Hercules asked if everything was fine here while he was gone. Titus told his brother that everyone had worked hard. The patriarch smiled and said that they were already aware of his accomplishments in Personia. They were all incredibly pleased. Hercules wasn't surprised, after all, it contributes to his ranking. Looking around, it was as if the emperor had lost someone. Titus asked him what was wrong, and Hercules asked his brother about where Hadrian was. He was absent on such an important day. But after all, Hercules knew that he did not like to show his face in public, and the hero agreed with Titus. The patriarch smiled at Galfes and said that he had heard the same about him. He had performed admirably. The patriarch's gaze fell on General Dalios, and his heart sank into his heels. Galfes assumed that the latter had apparently decided to let his highness's amnesty go to waste, and considered it rude. Christopher offered to drown him in the Lemurian Sea. Meanwhile, the patriarch took Hercules aside and nervously asked the hero why Dalios was here. After all, they were to execute him publicly. Hercules turned around to everyone and smiling said that he could consider it as a spoils of war. Also, he would be a vassal. General Dalios was scaring everyone with just his look and appearance. The patriarch asked his majesty if he was sure about it. Anyway, the war ended successfully because of him. The patriarch said he had prepared a place for Galfes at the banquet and asked him to pass. They assumed that the emperor was tired after the long campaign and there was no urgent business for today either, so he was asked to rest. Hercules slyly smiled and realized that for today he is completely free. Titus smiled and said he would make the best wine to celebrate their first victory in a long time. Galfes agreed with him and said it was all thanks to his majesty. Titus wanted to be sure to write a heroic tale about him. He asked Hercules for permission to hear all the details during the banquet. But turning around, everyone noticed that Hercules had disappeared. The patriarch asked where he was, because he was just here. Galfes turned around and noticed that Caroline was also not there. Galfes called out if anyone had seen Caroline. Titus sighed heavily and thought with a smile that maybe he had gone to get his reward. The girl was so stoic that she had sweat beading on her face. She turned to His Highness, saying that this was the first time she was wearing such clothes. She hesitantly asked if it really suited her. Hercules looked at the maid's skirt, which Caroline was trying to lengthen with her hand, and smiled. He said it was just perfect and excellent. He gave Carolina the maid costume to wear. Also, her hair was neatly gathered into a ponytail, and she had a cute bonnet on her head. She was very embarrassed as she tried to look away, but she was happy to see that His Highness liked it. The girl said that she was already feeling cold, and asked His Highness that she had already changed her clothes, but the hero called her name. Sitting on the chair, he said that it suits her very well. After all, he had just explained to her. The girl understood everything and blushed more and more each time. Caroline gritted her teeth and said that she was the gentleman's humble servant, and today she would serve him. Hercules smiled and said that she was good at it. The girl's ears were burning, and she was perplexed as to how it had come to this. Yes, she had indeed talked about a reward if the Lemurian army could prove themselves, but she never thought that His Majesty would prepare such a form for her. It was the very surprise he had taken from the suitcase from Titus. She was ashamed, for her skirt was scuffed at the slightest movement. Hercules smiled and proposed to start with tea. The girl looked away from embarrassment and asked what kind of tea he wanted, and the hero hesitated. Hercules said that he wanted black and looked at the red jar that was on top. Caroline said that everything would be fulfilled and was about to go for the latter. But Hercules asked her to stop and said that the latter was forbidden. She had to handle it herself, but using magic was also forbidden. The girl, trembling, reached for the jar. She felt embarrassed as her skirt was getting shorter and shorter. She realized she couldn't reach it, but it was possible if she lowered her skirt. Hercules ordered her hands away from her skirt, and Caroline clenched her fist with excitement. Standing on her tiptoes, Caroline diligently tried to reach the can, thinking there was just a little bit left. There was a little more as her skirt crept upward. How could she allow a proud knight of the Lemurian Empire to appear before the emperor like this? She wanted to tell His Majesty not to look, but he watched her carefully. He thought about her rising up a little more. He asked Caroline if she was taking too long for such a simple errand. But the girl said she wasn't reaching, so the guy suggested she just jump up, since she was an elf. Or she was willing to disobey an order just because her skirt might ride up. He had prepared the best clothes for her to appear in all her glory, and that's all her loyalty to the emperor. Caroline thought of His Majesty rushing into battle to save her. and she hesitated in such a simple situation and not even able to serve tea. She firmly decided that she should answer him in the same way and resolutely took out a jar of tea. After she took out the tea, she crouched down on her knee, flashing her panties in front of the emperor's face. Caroline smiled and apologizing said she would make him tea right away. Meanwhile, Hercules thought about the girl's underpants, which appeared to be black. Covering his forehead with his hand, he thought about the fact that Titus should be thanked. Caroline was outraged. Puffing up her cheeks, she told the gentleman that she would have to wait a little while for the tea leaves to brew. Hercules noticed that she was angry but still called him master. He called Caroline over and she looked at him unhappily. The boy held out his hands and motioned for her to come to him for a fitting. Putting down the tray, Caroline hesitantly stood in front of Hercules. He smiled at her and patting her on his lap asked her to sit down. Caroline wanted to resist and said that she was heavy, but Hercules replied that this was an order. With trembling knees, she climbed onto the hero's legs. Hercules asked her what was the matter, for during her training she had done it without a second thought. The girl averted her gaze and said it wasn't training after all. The guy hugged her and exclaimed that she was so cute, but Caroline resisted to the last and said he wouldn't bribe her with such cheap flattery. Hercules, still hugging her, apologized. He told her that he seemed to have gotten a little carried away and apologized again. The girl thought about the fact that something was bothering the hero. Hercules agreed, for he had always watched his father's back, and now he was going to war himself for the first time. It was a lot of pressure for him. The common people follow the emperor closely. Political and financial matters, improving infrastructure. That was why he had to win this war, so that the people would accept him. By winning, the number of people who displease him will also decrease. And that was like a mountain off his shoulders. He also managed to save her as well. The girl said that in that case, he should have shown up at the banquet. He should have appeared in heroic form before Christ and the rest of the bureaucrats. He should have shown his strength and manhood, to show all that he had shown her as well. On the battlefield, without a fraction of a doubt, he went straight to her to save her. Hercules looked at her in surprise. Caroline suddenly became embarrassed and apologized for her words. At such a moment, she assumed he should have been called Your Majesty. She realized that she had spoken too much. He took her cheeks and pulled her to the sides. The surprised girl asked him what he was doing. Amused, Hercules smiled and said that she was right. If he did that, Christ would not pick on him. But he asked Caroline to be his maid a little longer, getting as close to her face as possible. Caroline smiled embarrassedly and happily agreed. It was deep night, and the moon appeared from a thick cloud. Hercules was called by a voice, for which he opened his eyes. Someone was calling for his majesty. A dark haze like a fog appeared before him. It was a Deviless. Sitting on a guy wearing a light cape and underpants, she asked him if it was true that this night was beautiful. She looked at the guy with a smile and said that she was here to fulfill a contract. The hero was not surprised to see the girl in front of him. The Deviless grinned and said that she woke him up more than once, but he did not wake up. She had time to think that he was dead. But the hero didn't realize what she meant, noticing that they were now in her dream. The Deviless realized that Hercules was exhausted, but the contract must be fulfilled. She wanted to get what she needed as always. With those words, she leaned over to the hero and kissed him on the lips. Her name was Asmodeus, and he was the only one who could see her. She was his contracted spirit. She used to be a cherub, but she had become a fallen angel, transgressing beyond the mortal sin of lust. Now she was a demon. Among the 72 pillars, she is the 32nd. Her rank is queen. Those who made a contract with her were given a huge advantage. In return, however, she absorbed too much mana and more. 5 years ago, the patriarch praised the hero for the work he had done, saying that a great future awaited him. But Hercules remained silent. He felt that anyone in his family could have done it. It was enough to look in the library once a day that anyone could handle it at all. But the patriarch wanted to say that not all emperors could do that, but she kept silent. Hercules stared at the floor and said that every day is the same. Then he was pierced by a terrible pain and he grabbed his head. The patriarch was afraid for him. Hercules thought about what the hell was going on in his head. He was seeing certain pictures. Neither in other countries nor in the library books had he seen such places. Perhaps none of it belonged to this world. Going crazy, he had no idea where these people were from or what these places were. These were not his memories. The patriarch worriedly asked if he was all right. She wanted to call a doctor, but the hero flatly refused, saying that he would get some rest and it would go away. He asked not to tell anyone about it, and the patriarch had to listen to his majesty. Worried, the patriarch said that for today their classes were over and asked to call a maid in case of anything. The hero saw a bath mirror in front of him. A guy he didn't know was standing in front of him. He did not realize who it was. While he was going crazy, someone knocked on the door. Hercules was annoyed and asked to be left alone, but the knocks only got stronger. When he finally opened the door, he saw a woman in front of him who was wearing a maid's outfit. She smiled evilly at him. Hercules thought to himself that it was the new girl. He asked her if she had been taught manners. After all, she had forced open his door with her insistent knocking. The Deviless was still smiling the same way. She was a little surprised at this greeting. She seemed to realize she hadn't chosen the best outfit and instantly turned to a nightgown and erotic panties. The guy stood in shock. Abruptly closing the doors behind him, the guy didn't realize what was happening or how she could see the same clothes as from his memories. Behind the doors, the Deviless giggled evilly. Hovering over Hercules, the woman couldn't stop being amused by the surprised faces of the people. The guy didn't understand how she did it, but the Deviless said that he seemed to have that guy's memory. The hero didn't understand what she was talking about. It was like she knew he was tormented by the question of who was inside him. She asked not to worry about it because those memories didn't belong to him. This man from his memories was from a completely different world. They were his memories and had absolutely nothing to do with the hero. Speaking of another world, the guy thought she meant another kingdom. But she was talking about a completely different world, a different planet. This world was from a completely different timeline. The guy didn't understand how she knew all this, and the woman smiled and said that she was the one who fed him these memories. But she assumed the hero didn't remember it anymore. Hercules grabbed his throat as if afraid of being strangled. When he was just in the bud, she had implanted that man's memory into him. She wondered which one of them would survive. But it seems the man without ambition didn't stand a chance of defeating him, vain and ambitious with a sense of entitlement. In the end, his soul disappeared and his memories and experiences were passed on to him. Now he was himself, and that guy's soul was no longer a threat to him. Hercules thought about it and said that something was bothering him. He didn't understand why she had chosen him. Several hundred years ago, there was a man who united all the people of Lemuria and founded a monarchical country. He was, after all, her former master. His new approaches to country building had surprised her more than once. She could not let his country fall. Therefore, eventually this man would have died for nothing. But his knowledge is truly colossal and his mind is outstanding. He could be a savior and a ray of light for Lemuria, so she used him. But what was most important, now they had to make a contract. The hero looked at the devil incomprehensibly. She still had the same evil smile and apologized for not introducing herself. Of the 72 great spirits, she is the 32nd queen named Asmodeus. The hero was horrified, for Asmodeus was one of the great evils of mankind. As he tried to open the doors, he thought about the fact that if he made a contract with her, he would be finished. But the doors would not budge or open for him. In panic, he started beating his fists on the doors, trying to call for help. While he was screaming, a woman touched her palms to his head. She threw him to the ground, grabbing his hands, and told him that they were in her dream and no one could come here. In the real world, he was just sleeping. She got close to the guy's face and said she was going to make a man out of him. The guy gritted his teeth in anger and asked who would do such a thing. Asmodeus looked bloodthirstily at the guy and giggled again. She decided that this was fine after all. She loved people who had life beating out of them. She wondered how long he would last. What happened next he didn't remember very well. When he woke up, it was already morning and he was lying in his bed. Lying on his pillow, beside him was a devilish woman that laid her hand on his chest. After the contract, he became a perfect toy for him. Guy asked her to stop. He still had a persistent feeling like there was a swarm of bugs in his stomach. The streets of the night city were almost empty. Only one man was sitting on the ground, as if waiting for someone. A hooded man appeared in front of him and asked if he had the item. The guy demanded money first. The hooded man held out a sack of jingling coins, after which the elf gave him his item and said that it was none of his business now. The hooded man looked at the small thing in his hand and thought it was all for the sake of the empire. Hercules and Caroline were drinking and having fun at the banquet. Behind the castle pillars, hidden in the shadows, stood Hercules' older brother. After gloomily and quietly observing the situation in the hall, he creaked the door and entered the emperor's room. In front of him was a pillow with the emperor's crown on it. It was a delusion to him that his brother was the emperor. Hadrian gritted his teeth with anger and said that Hercules was getting his nose too far up his nose. He was absolutely sure that the empire needed him and asked the opinions of his subordinates. 3 subordinate elves bowed before him and kneeled down. They said that His Highness Hadrian was right. Nervously grabbing his clothes, Hadrian said that he was originally chosen by his father. He held out his hands for the crown. But no sooner had he taken it than the patriarchs came up to him and said it was strictly forbidden to touch the crown. They looked at Hadrian unhappily, and the brother recognized the archbishop. This is the great treasure of the Lemurian Empire that has been passed down honestly from generation to generation. Only the archbishop and the emperor could afford to touch the crown. It was not an object that could be touched so lightly. Hadrian grudgingly blurted out that his father had chosen him. He did not understand how the archbishop dared to point out to him the emperor's son. He was right that the emperor had planned to choose him as his heir, after all, he thought. Uncomprehending, Hadrian looked at the patriarch. The latter became terrifyingly serious, and with an intimidating look asked once again not to touch the emperor's crown. He said that if there was any hint of it, he might not expect a prayer of repose from his church. Hadrian was furious, and leaving said that he would remember him for it someday. The patriarchs looked at him in silence. He just ran away. Those who do not receive repose are equated with suicides whose sin is great. What was obvious was that he would retreat. The patriarch thought about being vigilant just in case. After all, there could be trouble with him. The next day, there was an exquisite lunch on the table. Hercules looked at the delicious food with a smile, and Caroline, who was standing behind him, was similarly choking on her saliva. The chef told His Majesty that he had prepared it all for him in the best way. Aquapazza margarita, capre with calzones, and tomato paste. Lunch is abundant with his favorite tomatoes. Caroline told His Highness it looked delicious. Hercules took a slice of pizza and tasted it. The cook came over to him and asked him how it tasted. Hercules said that it tasted even better than last time, which the cook was delighted about. His words were a delight to his ears. He said he would try even harder to make food that would make him tear up with happiness. Having cut back on infrastructure and palace maintenance, he used his money for other things, cooking. The chefs used only the freshest produce from all over the empire. And cooking was done by the best family of cooks that his father hired. That was why all the food in front of him was the best in the world. However, the boy noticed something. He said that it was all getting stale, and the cook was shocked. He was upset and assumed that the Majesty didn't like the food, but that wasn't the case. He liked those tomatoes at first. The pizza and the soups, everything was delicious. But the flavor hardly ever changes, so he had gotten sick of this food by now. The cook snickered and asked how that was the case. Carolina asked if he would like to taste anything else. Hercules thought of that guy's memories and wanted to taste the same thing. Hercules called this dish curry. The cook immediately went to the kitchen and said he would make him carry, but Hercules said it was a different dish. Curry is a common name. It uses many different seasonings and spices. It is boiled, fried, and sometimes cooked with fruit. The main spices were cumin, coriander, cardamom, turmeric, chili pepper, allspice, and so on. There were times when black pepper and cayenne pepper were added. Caroline was surprised that there was even such a food. The cook said that all those spices were pretty spicy. Hercules thought about the fact that if all these spices were familiar to the cook, he would be able to make this dish. But judging by the look on his face, it would be difficult to reproduce everything from memory. Hercules allowed that way to look for spices outside of their empire. Hercules introduced their new cook named Nala. Nala said hello in front of everyone. The cook was shocked and asked the emperor what this slave was doing here. Hercules said that he wanted to taste curry and that all the spices could be obtained in their country, so he brought their cook as well. It was true that he was a former slave, but the Church of the Messiah had converted him to their faith, and he was now free. Nala went up to the cook and shook hands with him. Calling him a superior, Nala was glad to know him. The cook noticed that he spoke courteously. Hercules smiled and ordered him to get down to business. The cook asked His Majesty to wait. As the head of the kitchen, and one who serves for the good of the Lemurian palace, he still had pride. He could not let an unknown person into his sanctuary. He asked to at least test the newcomer's cooking skills and then make a decision. Hercules agreed with him, and he had an idea. He gathered the judges from his subordinates around 2 tables. And when everything was ready, he said that he had assembled the best jury for the good of the palace. He told his subordinates that it was time for the tasting. Including him, there were 7 people on the jury. They had to satisfy each of the languages. For formality, he hired Nal as the court cook. Caroline smiled. She wondered what curry tasted like. But Hercules told her that he wanted to find out himself. Caroline's father had tasted the food of the Sindelians and looked forward to it. But for a mere bishop, a meal with lots of spices was an unacceptable luxury. Panther warned sullenly that he would not let them try to slip him any junk. The cook who sat on the jury did not understand what he was doing here. Cannel came out with a cart of food and apologized for the wait. Opening the dish right in front of the emperor, Hercules' eyes shone. Everything looked very delicious and gorgeous. It was curried chicken and butter, spinach curry, and also kimai curry, and tandoori with chicken. The characters also said that the smell was very pleasant. Christopher started to get nostalgic about his times. Caroline was delighted and said it looked very appetizing. Panther sighed and said the dish was too hot. The cook still looked at the dish in front of him incomprehensibly. The bishop smiled and offered to offer prayers to the Lord first. The patriarch thanked the father for the food and said they would graciously accept his gift. All the heroes prayed and asked that the food on this table be blessed, that they might support their bodies and their spirits. The prayer was ended. Hercules smiled and said it was time to begin. Tearing off a tortilla, he thought about where he should start. He dipped the tortilla in one of the curries and was the very first of all to taste it. Caroline and the panther watched him with interest. Canal asked His Majesty how it tasted, and Hercules' eyes lit up. He said it was delicious. He insisted that everyone try the dish. Everyone decided to try a different one, some with spinach curry, some with tandoori chicken, and some with chime. After 30 minutes, everyone was done with their food. Caroline was still munching on the food, talking about how delicious it all was. It was just an exhilarating flavor. It was that Sindelian cuisine. The patriarch was eating everything and talking about how you can't do that. You can't eat food that good. Nal worriedly asked General Pantero why he wasn't eating, and he irritably said he was waiting for the dish to cool down. Nal smiled, and the cook noticed that everyone seemed to appreciate his cooking well. He looked at the food in front of him, wondering what the food tasted like from the stranger. Truth be told, spicy wasn't to his liking, but he decided to give it a try. After trying it, the cook was extremely surprised, and so was Hercules. The hero thought about how the food would still be much spicier, but it was still delicious. Nail apologized and said he cooked it according to his own recipe, which surprised Hercules. As the emperor knew, it is very hot in their country, and they are cooled by cold sweat, and when you eat spicy food, you sweat a lot. That's why their curry is so spicy. When you eat curry, you sweat, and it gets cool. But he didn't know how the locals felt about spicy food, so he added some apples and honey. Carolina admitted that she would have preferred a sweeter flavor. But even so, it was delicious. Canal was pleased that even here they knew about the cuisine from his parts of the world. And he also enjoyed watching the satisfied faces of those eating his cooking. The cook looked at the boy in surprise. He remembered how he had been called a useless wastrel as a child. How he was told he would spend his whole life peeling potatoes. He was called a redneck and told to mind his own business. But he decided that he would make a delicious meal for the emperor someday. Hercules smiled and said it was time to pass judgment. He asked for a show of hands for those who would like to taste Nala's cooking again. All the subordinates would like to taste his spicy food again and raise their hands. Caroline would like a sweeter flavor and raised her hand. Even the panther raised his hand. Hercules joined them, saying he would like to taste a spicier flavor or with other curry ingredients. Hercules looked at the cook and asked for his opinion. After a little thought, he still decided to raise his hand and said that in order to make more suitable food for the Lemurians, they should rid him of his habit of bitterness. Nal thanked him. He also wished that Nal had warned him when he needed utensils of that size. Nal apologized and said he needed it, but the chef needed to reprimand him. Hercules looked at them with a smile. The hero asked Nal to carry more, and Caroline asked for tandoori chicken as well. Christopher asked with spinach, also everyone else wanted a refill. The chef got up from the table and said he would prepare the desserts. Looking at Nala, he involuntarily recalled his past. He must have clung to his position too much. He had forgotten the most important thing, remembering what Nal had said about people's smiles. After eating such a hot meal, he decided to make refreshing fruit desserts. He turned around and looked at the emperor that he patted his full belly. He smiled, talking about how he hadn't been so full in a long time. The cook apologized and said that the desserts were ready. Hercules' eyes lit up with happiness again. He served Hercules a fresh melon. The hero tasted it and said it was the most needed thing after the spicy curry. He admitted that the melon was the best. Caroline laughed at him. Canal served the melon to the rest of the jury, but the panther looked at the plate unhappily and incomprehensibly. Hercules had already finished the last piece. But then Hercules noticed the liquid and shouted and ordered no one to eat it. All became alarmed, and the cook looked at the emperor incomprehensibly. Caroline wanted to run up to Hercules as she was turned around by the panther and struck in the upper part of her body with her fist. Everyone watched in shock as Carolina threw up right on the floor. Carolina's father grabbed the panther by his clothes and asked what he was doing, but Hercules demanded that it stop. The melon was poisoned. The entire staff was in shock. Everyone was talking about His Majesty being poisoned. But people did not talk about it loudly, for it was not allowed to be talked about. They had heard about the poison being in the melon. They wondered how he felt, and they wondered who had done it. The girl walked forward with a determined step, tapping her heels against the floor. The elf tried to catch up with her, asking the princess where she was going. She needed to talk to Hercules. But she couldn't do that, for the previous emperor had forbidden her to do so. But Eudocia, the mother of the three princes, was against it. According to her, His Highness is the future of their country, and more importantly, her son. It is quite obvious that she is worried about him. She did not understand how this could have happened. She prayed to God to help her son. The patriarch checked Hercules' pulse and temperature, saying everything was fine. There were no abnormalities. He was lucky he didn't have time to bite off where the poison was. Christopher didn't understand how a melon could be poisoned. Most likely they had made small holes and then injected a calibrated amount of poison into them afterward. If they hadn't noticed the requiescence of the poison and the silver plate, the emperor would already be under the lid of the coffin. All thanks to Dalios, but he said he just noticed the rust on his plate, while those seated nearby were munching away. He glanced at Caroline, but she just sighed heavily and said she had nothing to say. The general apologized to His Highness for his behavior, for he was distraught when his former enemy struck his daughter. Hercules could understand him, and the father thanked Dalios for saving his daughter, but he only muttered something under his nose and turned away. Hercules looked at the cook and wondered how he could have poisoned him. But the chef said that he cooked with all his heart, and he would never think of killing his own creation, much less killing the emperor himself. Hercules asked him where he got that melon. He told the emperor that Hadrian's aide, Mr. Delmico, had brought it. They met him in the corridor as he was on his way to the kitchen. He told him it was to celebrate His Majesty's victory. In all likelihood, he was an aristocrat close to Hadrian. Assuming this was the work of an aristocracy left dissatisfied that they could no longer pocket the money, quite a possible move. Since then, he had sided with Hadrian. The patriarch thought about it and had something he wanted to tell Hercules, though he wasn't sure what it would prove. After listening to him, Hercules understood everything. The general was shocked by his story, not understanding how Hadrian wanted to touch the crown. After all, it is a crime. Christopher understood why he was not present during the banquet. The patriarch offered to find Dominic, but Hercules said that it would be useless and they would not find out anything. After all, he is in charge of importing and exporting fruit. Arranging an interrogation, they will not achieve anything. The chief kept begging me to believe him. He didn't know the melon was poisoned. He begged us to believe him. Canal was on the chef's side, saying he was a good man who even shook his hand. But Hercules grimly said that he knew it, for he had just been taken advantage of. Nevertheless, he could not now assert this with complete certainty. And until his doubts were dispelled, he forbade the cook to enter the kitchen. As the guards led the cook away, Hercules looked at Caroline, who was also eating the poisoned melon. He asked her to rest and asked why she was here. She said that she couldn't just go to bed while his life was threatened. It was at a time like this that she felt she had to be by his side and protect him. Before she could finish, a hand grabbed her and pulled her toward her. As the emperor sat on the bed, he placed Carolina's head on his lap. Caroline was embarrassed as usual. She didn't know what to say to him as suddenly a woman opened the door and apologized. It was Caroline's mother and the wife of General Galfes. She was concerned about how the emperor was feeling. Galfes was shocked to see her here, since he had asked her not to come here. Caroline also jumped up on the bed, but she said she was worried, so she came. Hercules thought about the fact that she didn't notice anything and said it was no big deal. She took the emperor's hand and knelt before him. She apologized that her husband and daughter were powerless at that moment and could not help him. Hercules smiled and asked in that case to thank Galios, for it was he who had saved her daughter. The girl approached the disgruntled panther and bowed to him, thanking him for his help. She admired his muscles and said so. Galios did not understand what she wanted. The girl turned to the hero and offered to try some bean and garlic soup if he had an appetite. The patriarch remarked that this was an excellent idea, for garlic could neutralize the poison. He recommended the hero to eat more garlic for a while. Hercules asked Caroline if she would do the same. Carolina was embarrassed and said that she didn't really like garlic. But Hercules took a spoon and asked her to open her mouth. She thought about the fact that she couldn't even kiss him in that setting. Caroline's mother put her hand to her lips. She whispered in the emperor's ear that her daughter was still a virgin. Caroline heard everything and choked on her soup. She shouted to her mother that she had found the perfect time to talk about such a thing, but she was worried about her future, wasn't she? She was so immersed in martial arts that she didn't pay attention to anything else. She was worried about her daughter becoming someone's wife. Caroline asked her if she even realized to whom she was whispering this. But Galfes had told her daughter that such information was very important. She couldn't believe that her father was in the same place. The girl hugged her daughter and said that their little girl was so cute. Caroline tried to get rid of the hug, reminding them that the emperor himself was in front of them. After the incident with his brother 10 years ago, Hercules' father reconsidered the direction of their upbringing and restricted his meetings with his mother. Oion forbade them to address as parent to child, and they only met for formality. And this continued to this day, even after their father's death. She continued to visit him as an emperor. Even when he was lying down with a fever, she never once came to visit him. It was also obvious that she would also not come now. Hercules thought about that, which was driving him a bit into ennui. But no sooner had he thought about it than he heard his mother's voice addressing his highness by name. A servant walking behind her apologized, saying he tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. Hercules looked at his mother in shock. Christopher tried to tell his sister that by doing so she was resisting the previous king's order. But the woman asked him to be quiet, telling Hercules that she needed to talk to him. Hercules ordered them to stand back. He realized that he wasn't just running a fever now, they were trying to kill him after all. And she would of course rush to her son when he was in such danger. She bowed to her son and said she had come here to talk about what had happened today. She asked if the person who did it had been found. Hercules was pretty sure that his brother was involved, but he had no proof yet. To his mother, they are both equally her children, but his brother was out of line. Even so, Hercules was certain that the mother would do the same as the father had once done. The woman appealed to his majesty. She asked him to take pity on him, which surprised the hero. She spoke of how he had tried every day to become what he was now, and she was the one who always looked out for him, and she came here to tell him that. The mother was certain that the brother had acted impulsively, but had no desire to cause harm. Besides, she reminded him that he was his own brother. She asked that he be spared. Hercules asked her if that was all she had come here for, and the woman interrogated the hero about what he meant. Either way, he had no proof, so there was nothing he could do about it. However, as the emperor, he couldn't turn a blind eye to it, and said that the one would be brought to trial. The woman was simply shocked. She grabbed Hercules by his pants and begged for him not to be killed. Christopher tried to push his sister away. She addressed him by name, like a son, and Hercules told her that he would try to do his best, within limits, of course. The woman folded her arms and headed for the exit. She told Hercules that she was thinking of going to a convent. She wanted to pray for her husband's peace, her son's dreams, and her own sin for not stopping him. She decided to surrender to God, and everyone looked at her in surprise. Hercules smiled and told his mother that if that was what she had decided, he dared not contradict her. He asked if she had decided which convent she would go to, and the woman nodded. In that case, he bade her farewell. As the door closed behind her, Caroline looked questioningly at the hero. Hercules told Galfes and Christopher to gather everyone, announcing a meeting. The brother would be put on trial. Hadrian, meanwhile, took out his anger on the pillow. Stabbing it with a pair of scissors, he talked in rage about what an eyesore his brother was. He hoped he should have just died quietly. A servant came in and said his mother was here to see him. But in response, a pair of scissors flew at him. Hadrian ordered her to be thrown out. He was sure that she had come as usual to beg for him to become a vassal. Gritting his teeth, he cursed the assembly of elders, for his brother could bribe them with his sweet speeches of aristocrats. Hercules stood before the tribunes of men and addressed the honored fathers and those who would become them. He spoke of their country being in danger. Heretics and ill-wishers had taken their lands from them. If this continues, they will lose everything altogether. They must take back what is rightfully theirs, what his grandfather fought for. He already had a strong army at his disposal, and their chances were great. He raised his fist up and declared the war to reclaim the lands open. Everyone supported him with shouts. Hadrian looked at his father's portrait and asked him why he had not given the crown to him. It was already deep into the night as Hadrian lay in bed. As suddenly he heard the door creak and he looked at it. Right in front of him, he saw a girl that regarded him closely. She smiled at him and wished him a good evening. She told him that this night was just beautiful. Hadrian looked at the spirit incomprehensibly and embarrassed. He asked in bewilderment who she was. The girl was completely naked and wings of light appeared behind her. She smiled and said that she thought that people liked this kind of greeting. The girl turned to a light bikini and said that she was an archangel and the first of the 3 pillars of Gibril. In shock, the boy slipped his hand and fell off the bed, not believing there was an archangel in front of him. The girl gasped at the fact that this was the first time Hadrian was seeing an angel. Turning away, he said he never imagined they dressed like that. Lifting the young man's face with her hands, she said she had a message for him from God. She told him that Hercules, the current ruler of this country, would soon be on a campaign to the Principality of Treachery. Thanks to his achievements and the surrender of Dalios, he has gained a great deal of support within the country. Now he wishes to regain all the lands he has lost. The recent gathering of nobles was for just that purpose. Hadrian was angry that Hercules had gotten so wound up after only one victory. But he didn't understand where the angel got this information from, and she told him that the information was firsthand. She just overheard them. Like she said, they would start with the Principality of Treachery. They got together to discuss it. Hercules said that the Oin would start with Dalios. It was important for the hero to know the analysis of the losing enemy, and so he was interested in the Panther's point of view. Dalios believed that he lost for the reason that there was no one else who could lead a large army besides him. If there had been anyone else, they would have been able to better distribute their army and confront them. But he had absolutely no opportunity to choose another commander. But he also didn't trust the mercenaries. They could be easily bribed with money and lured to the other side. This is actually what the emperor demonstrated. Hercules agreed with him. If it were a plateau, they would have easily managed it. The most important reason for his defeat was that he stole his father's lands. Hercules understood why Dalios did this and was in solidarity with him. But it didn't make any sense if he doesn't deal with the country afterward. Without understanding how to run a country, there is no point in expanding possessions. Hercules said he wouldn't let that happen, and he would do what was right. So he asked the Panther to work hard. After his opinions were heard, Hercules wanted to listen to the Lemurians. If it was remembered about that battle and his instructions, there were no censures on strategy of any kind. The main issue was weapons. Caroline looked questioningly at Hercules, who brought out the figures on the table for demonstration. During the Battle of Personia, the infantrymen used mostly swords and shields, and one group was armed with long spears. These spears are called saurus and were used by the Lemurians several millennia ago. Due to their length of 5 meters, arming cavalrymen with them is much more effective than giving them swords. However, in the last battle, he realized that it was a bad idea. They were constantly hitting the ground and were not suitable for close combat, which immediately broke the formation. Most just dropped their spears and took up swords. Their kingdom is surrounded by deserts, plains, and mountainous terrain. Among the enemies observed are nomads and mountain dwellers who have adapted to their terrain. If they are faced with the fact that because of the landscape they cannot use weapons, it will be bad. But they couldn't categorize weapons for certain terrains either. Instead of the same daggers, it was better to take spears. They had to use something either 7 meters long so that the enemy army couldn't reach them, and use shields to protect them from arrows. Such a distance would be an advantage over the enemy. At the same time, it should be light, and so that it would not get in the way, so that it would not break the formation, and to be able to carry a shield. Hercules asked his handmaidens if they had any suggestions as to what kind of weapon it could be. All sat just in shock from such a strange question. Dalios suggested the crazy idea of using everything at once. It was easy for Galfes to say it, but to bring such a thing to life, it was simply impossible. But since the emperor asked, What else could they do? Hercules pointed his finger at the panther, and a thought struck him. Frightened, the panther jumped up on his chair. Hercules said that they would equip their army from this. They will train all the way to the show. The Archangel told Hadrian that this is how they do their training step by step. Hadrian smiled caustically, calling his brother arrogant, and thought that he was still a long way away from the shower techniques. The girl probably agreed with him, but there was something interesting. She said that their trek had failed. This meant that to reach the Principality of Trevisos, they would go by sea. However, under the wrath of the spirits, they would be caught in a storm. Unable to find a way out, they'll be swept away by the waves. And in the end, they will all drown. Hadrian didn't understand how things could go so smoothly, but the Archangel said it could be that way. In one world, the army of a huge kingdom was caught in a storm twice. And then the legends of the wind god began. Anyway, she told Hadrian that Hercules didn't even realize it. Right now he was gathering an army and preparing for a campaign. But Hadrian said he didn't care. What he cared about was the throne that he was to inherit. His father, that he continued to defend the country and the traditions, all of which Hadrian was to inherit. For he loved his father more than anyone else and suffered greatly when he was gone. After he had gone, a light with an outline appeared over the king's bed in front of his loved ones. It was a light to which Hadrian tried to reach with his hand. But without obeying, the light fell in front of everyone, directly on Hercules. He was the most hated among the heirs, but his father, his vassal, and even the magic of the inheritance chose him. Everyone chose him and bowed to the new emperor. His father's country and everyone's, Hadrian loved the most. Hercules may have been more capable than Hadrian, but he took absolutely everything away from him. Mother saw the magic seal and told him to obey the new emperor. But he was furious and thought the crown, father and mother, everything belonged to him. He wanted to kill the man who had stolen everything from him. He wanted it all back. The Archangel smiled, saying that by all appearances the man had suffered greatly. But she told him that all was well now, and he would be protected by the master himself. She promised that he would soon take his rightful place and lead the empire to prosperity. Hadrian did not understand what she meant. The girl pressed the lad to her big balls and told him it would come true. But first she wanted to reward him with something. The guy screamed, not realizing if he could really become emperor. But then he jumped up from the bed and reached out his hand into the void. Noticing that no one was there, he thought to himself that it was only a dream. Just when he thought that the Archangel would not be here, he heard some rustling. He looked at his hand, which held a piece of paper. Not knowing what it was, he decided to open it and read it. When he looked at it, he was shocked. It was a route map to the Principality of Trevisos. He didn't understand what it was doing here, but then a quill flew near him. Taking the quill in his hands, Hadrian realized everything. Hadrian involuntarily laughed, and with a bloodthirsty smile said that now he would be able to throw Hercules off his seat. A servant came into the room. He apologized when he saw that His Highness was already awake. Hadrian told Dominic that he was just in time. He ordered the troops to assemble. Dominic thought Hadrian was talking about a tax to fund the troops, but that wasn't what Hadrian meant. Hercules was going on a campaign to the Principality of Trevisos, and he wanted to attack him as soon as he returned. Dominic was concerned that Hadrian wanted to raise a rebellion and didn't understand why he would do such a thing now. But Hadrian, approaching the curtain, said that now he was lucky. And now the Lord God himself was on his side. With these words, he pulled back the curtains at the window sharply. Wrapping himself in the curtains like a cloak, he said that all the dirt and sorrow of his life was because of his brother, and he would make him feel them and kill Hercules. Hercules was told that they could perform according to plan. Hercules put his handmaidens in charge of the preparations, and he will tell the people that the lost lands will be theirs again. Christopher told him that all would be fulfilled. Hercules also told him that his brother trying to kill him once would want to do it again. Caroline squeezed Hercules' hand and said she would not let that happen. Hercules smiled at her and thought to himself that it wasn't going to happen anyway. He was sure his brother hadn't noticed yet that he had everything in the palm of his hand. With these thoughts, Hercules headed towards the castle exit. He appeared before the people below his balcony. He greeted the audience with outstretched arms. Meanwhile, Hadrian gazed gloomily out of the window and thought that it was several days since Hercules had embarked on the plan. The people were chatting among themselves. They hadn't heard anything like this during the Council of Elders conversation. It was just as the Archangel Jibril had told him. There was still something else that was not clear. It was said that this vision had come to His Highness Hadrian in a dream. With these words spoken to him, Hadrian stopped. He looked at the nobles with a fearful look, and they were horrified and asked for his forgiveness. He demanded that they listen to him, for his father should have chosen him, not Hercules. After all, he is a favorite of the gods and a true emperor. This message should be compensation for all his suffering. A chance given to him by the archangel Jibril, and he could not miss it. Hadrian assumed that the same thing had happened to the aristocrats. If not for his brother, their situation would also be better. Unwittingly, those agreed with him. Hadrian gloomily looked at the Bulgaronians and assumed that they had also had a bad trade with the emperor. The Bulgaronians were a nomadic people, mostly including one race, but it also included elves of royal and noble blood. Their main trade currency was sheep. From time to time, they were marauded by the Lemurians, all because the terms of trade did not suit Hercules. The people began to discuss something with each other. Hadrian smiled as it became clear to him. He understood the aristocrats without words, and he would certainly want to take advantage of their barbarism on the field. Suddenly, someone began to burst through the door. Hadrian irritably asked what the rumbling was about. An elf broke in and, apologizing, said that Hercules and an army of 40,000 Lemurians had been sunk in the Sea Artle. The aristocrats began to discuss things amongst themselves again. Everything was as it had been in the vision. Dominic asked Hadrian what he thought about it. Hadrian smiled and said that now he understood everything. It really was a message. He turned to the aristocrats and said that they were the best of the best for not listening to his brother's speech. At last, the moment came for him when the dawn of his brother's defeat dawned on him. He promised to bestow honor and glory on each of them. For the next emperor was him. He raised his hand upward and all shouted to him, accepting the new emperor Hadrian. If we rely on the map of sea routes, Hercules must return to this port. They would meet him on the plateau nearest the port. He wanted to throw him off his horse and capture him. With his hands, Hadrian wanted to squeeze out his weeping eyes and cut off his head that would beg for mercy. Standing in the armor in front of the soldiers, Hadrian threw his hands up in the air and shouted that his brother would pay for everything in front of his father's grave. As the army of soldiers stood at the ready, Hadrian thought about why Hercules was late, or whether he had so small a troop left that he was out of sight. Just then, a sentinel soldier shouted to everyone that Hercules' troop was approaching. Hadrian laughed bloodily, for he was already bored of waiting. This was the only day he wanted to see his brother. He asked Hercules to show his face. Hercules appeared on the horizon, riding ahead of his troop on horseback. Seeing him and the soldiers, Hadrian was horrified and cursed with a mat to himself. He couldn't understand how Hercules had such a huge army. There was no end to them. Hadrian looked at the soldier who couldn't explain such a thing. According to their report, most of it should have been left at the bottom of the sea. According to Hadrian's prediction, they shouldn't have looked so lively and healthy. He couldn't believe that the archangel's instruction could be wrong. They should have sunk to incur the wrath of the sea spirit. There was no way he could believe that the sea spirits could like a man like Hercules. Even if he did say so, the soldiers did not know what they could do in such a situation. Seeing Hadrian from afar, Hercules said that it was fine that they were nervous. With a wry smile, Hercules asked if Caroline could see it, but she sadly lowered her head, not wanting to see it. A man came up from behind and said that it was just a pathetic sight. Without even checking the information, Hadrian so easily believed that His Majesty's army had sunk into the sea. It was Hercules' half-brother Edmund. In his opinion, it was unfortunate to have a completely unthinking brother, which only spoiled the emperor's blood. Hercules grinned at him and said that Hadrian was their common brother. Edmund apologized for the reservation. This mustachioed man Edmund was a half-elf from a military family, a half-brother on his father's side. During the war with Dalios, he was assigned to protect the capital. However, this time, the protection was entrusted to Garfis. Hercules noticed that he was very different from them, for they seemed to live in almost the same conditions. Edmund sighed and said he would take it as a compliment from His Majesty. Caroline remarked that His Highness Titus was also to stand there, but he didn't want to. The younger brother approached Titus, saying that it was His Majesty's order. Preparations for the march were now underway. Clutching his malbert, Titus said he didn't care about their war. He had been visited by a muse, and if he threw down the brush just now, he would be a disgrace to the family. The elf tugged at Titus' arm, trying to dissuade him. He suggested that Hadrian might try to kill him while he was sitting here. But Titus said that dying with a paintbrush in his hands is the cherished wish of any artist. He's not going anywhere. Hercules covered his ears at this story, and Caroline suggested that he wouldn't even come to the meeting. Hercules said that it was all because the man was treating him wrong. Hercules knew how to get Titus to budge and ordered him to listen carefully. They should have approached Titus and asked him how about skits outside the castle. His eyes would have lit up and he would have gladly agreed. Hercules said he was easy to bribe. Edmund didn't even know what to say, thinking that it seems like he's only surrounded by brothers like that. But even now, when he represents one of the soldiers of the imperial army, all he does is keep drawing, just nonsense. Hercules said there's nothing he can do about it, and it's still better than if he stayed in the castle and got killed. But anyway, Hercules smiled and said he would serve him. With pity, Hercules looked at Hadrian, who was not aware of anything. He did not notice anything at all. His father had bowed his head to the nobility time after time to make him emperor. And his mother, breaking the prohibition, bowed her head to him just to make amends to her son. They loved Hadrian more than anyone else. Hercules did not steal anything from his brother, and was sure that if the latter had not made mistakes, he could have become emperor. He was sorry that now he must take the country his parents loved into his own hands. Hercules said that they were beginning the purge. General Pantera said that here they were learning about all the members of the rebellion. With this meeting, they can suppress Hadrian and all his accomplices by ripping out the contagion at the root. It's better than doing a gradual purge. It's better to have a full-scale battle once, and show that it's better for them not to stand up against him. General Galfes told His Majesty that he had arrived. Hercules was glad to see him. He asked how Christopher was, and Galfes said he was fine. Only he was upset that he wouldn't be able to see the bickering nephews in person. Hercules grinned at his words. After all, Christopher himself was cautious, and even returned under protection to the castle. Hercules said that they should finish quickly and return with souvenirs and stories. Hadrian looked towards his brother in disgust. He couldn't understand why things had gotten this way. He had asked Gibril why his army had not sunk into the sea. After all, she had said that the Lord was on his side. He was sure that this was a test given to him by the Lord, and he should have been able to handle it with ease. Hadrian asked the soldier what the strength of their army was. The number of infantrymen reached 18,000, 2,000 crossbowmen and cavalrymen each, and another 8,000 cavalrymen as support from Bulgarin. All in all, about 30,000. Hadrian asked about the size of the enemy detachment. They were behind the walls of the fort, so it was impossible to count the exact number. The regular army includes about 20,000 infantrymen and about 10,000 archers and cavalrymen each. The total is about 40,000. Hadrian realized that the difference was 10,000 soldiers, but he was confident that they still had a chance of victory. More precisely, he was absolutely certain that victory would be theirs. Hadrian shouted that they would end everything on this plateau, but then someone behind him asked him to wait. It was a young black warrior with curls that said that they should avoid the battle on the plateau. Hadrian irritably asked him who he even was. The soldier introduced himself as Oscar Allman. He asked His Majesty to think again. Another soldier told Hadrian in a whisper that Oscar is the youngest son of the Allman family. The Allmans have owned vast Mysian southern lands since ancient times. They were a strong economic pillar for the empire. With such immense financial power, the long-eared race envied them. However, the Allmans also had a similar feeling towards the elves. In the past, these factions had clashed more than once in debates or even skirmishes. And at this point, the Allmans had joined the so-called Hadrian wing. Unfortunately for Oscar Allman, the second son of the Almonians, he was attached as an advisor to Hadrianos. Hadrian was enraged, saying that he was not even from the main branch and was nameless and dared to advise him. However, everything depended on what he wanted to tell him. Oscar understood His Majesty. At this point, their forces and the enemies were almost equal. But the enemy General Galfes that personally trains and commands the army were the elite. Oscar considered the heavy cavalry to be the most dangerous enemy. As for their army, it was motley and had many problems such as interaction. In addition, they wore armor from the past generation that they were not used to. Hadrian didn't see any problems in such a case. Oscar said that it wasn't just that either. It was as if it was hard for him to say it, so he remained silent. After a while, he said that according to Mrs. Gibril's prediction, Hercules' army should have been drowned, but they saw a completely different picture. The enemy was well prepared for battle. In this regard, Oscar had a bad feeling. It was as if they had driven them into a trap. They would have a better chance of victory if they fought from the fortress instead of on the plateau. Oscar asked for more thoughts from Hadrian, who was just standing there in a frenzy. He grabbed the guy by his chain mail and lifted him up and asked him what he even knew about this. After all, he was talking about getting hammered in the fortress by him, the emperor. He had suffered enough humiliation from his brother. And be it even the purest plateau, he would make him chew the ground. Hadrian got as close to Oscar as possible and ordered him, as a nameless man, not to dare order such a thing to the emperor. In anger, he threw the guy away from him that he fell to the ground. Hadrian ordered him to return to his seat if he understood. Gritting his teeth, Oscar bowed and asking for prescription ran away. Hadrian raised his hand and said that they were blessed by God himself. He ordered everyone to keep up their fighting spirit. Oscar was sure that Adrianos would not live because Hercules would definitely win. He had to think of something to get their army out. 3 days had passed since Hercules' army and Hadrian's army had met. Both sides had completed their fortifications. In all this time, not a single provocation has been directed towards Hercules' army. No archers fired, no stones thrown. War was coming, yet the stagnation on the battlefield continued. Caroline was looking at the outpost of Hercules' army in the distance as someone approached from behind. Dalios looked through the spirit eye and told Hercules that the enemy army had prepared well. There were about 30,000 of them. Hercules said that it was all rotten, and yet they were aristocrats. It is a problem for them to gather such an army. It's not just the emperor who has a position in their army. The aristocracy also has a certain number of warriors. If you compare this empire to the other empire, it is extremely insecure. Even after repelling the robbers' attack once, it is impossible to eradicate them. Most of those who possessed property had the means to defend themselves. So it's obvious why the aristocracy had mercenaries. Unlike mercenaries like Darius, aristocrats have had an advantage here and there since ancient times. The main house has its own vassals, and the branch houses have their own. And those have their own, and so on. If you combine their power together, you could get a really strong army. That's why Hercules didn't like aristocrats. Through ties and blood, they inherit power. Blood ties were considered strength. Enormous power derived from nowhere. To deny such power is like denying an innate talent given by a god. Darius said the same is true of his majesty, and Hercules agreed with him. But these blood ties turn into plain red water if they started to rot. Blue noble blood simply becomes devalued. Hercules suggested in that case that these ties be given back to the god, here and now. He looked at the aides behind him and asked what they would say to that. Hercules was sitting with Darius on the observation tower as someone approached them. It was the Bulgaronians and also Carolina. Galfis thought they were on the enemy's side and asked what they were doing here. But Hercules assured him that all was well, for it was he who had called them here. Bulgarian troops were masters of marauding. In open combat, their advantage was negated. The fact that they engaged in open battle seemed strange to Hercules, so he sent a messenger to them, and what was in front of them now was living proof of that. Hercules looked at the general of the Bulgaronians and asked what he had to say. The general was surprised and asked Hercules how he knew their language. Hercules said that if you look for a personal teacher, it is not that difficult. Hercules smiled and said that being good friends and allies, it is not proper for the emperor not to know their language. They shook hands, and the Bulgaronian general remarked that the emperor was so young. Hercules offered to go to his tent, leaving the rest to Garfis. Hercules told the general that this time he was willing to turn a blind eye to what he had seen. But the general interrogated him about what he meant. Hercules offered to make an agreement and walked to the table where there was already paper and pen. The general swallowed the lump in his throat and sat down on a creaking chair opposite the emperor. Hercules said that the agreement was divided into 4 parts: a mutual agreement where attack was forbidden, the launching of official trade routes. The Bulgaronian king is obliged to send troops at the request of the emperor of Lemuria. Lemuria would pay an annual tax to Bulgarin. The warriors and their general took the paper in their hands and, reading it, asked Hercules what it was. Hercules told them that they were a nomadic people. If they continue to give up farming like this, life will not get better. And keeping healthy with meat alone is no good. To start farming, you need technology, grain, and other things. To get it, you had to either plunder or trade. In this case, they decided to use the battle for the throne to loot what they needed. And if the throne doesn't work out, Hadrian will ascend. Hercules smiled evilly and asked them if he would compromise with them in such a case. The general looked apprehensively at the emperor, but Hercules said that they were allies and they would regard it as a misdemeanor. How far he could foresee their actions. Taking pen in hand, the general made a decision and said that Bulgarin no longer participates in the war. At the same time, he thought shockably about who this guy was. Unlike his predecessor, he felt a terrible pressure from him. He simply had a piercing gaze that knew literally everything. The general was certain that if they made a single wrong move, he would simply devour them. The emperor took the paper in his hands and said that they were now bound by the agreement. In that case, he asked his friends to disappear. Hadrian looked in horror at the Bulgarian army that was just walking away from him. He shouted at them not to dare to break formation. The soldier who approached Hadrian said they had a message from a Bulgarian envoy. They had made an agreement with the Lemurian Empire. In that case, they are withdrawing from this war. Hadrian was simply out of his mind at his message. He punched a soldier in the face with all his might, calling them damn nomads. That was why he thought they couldn't be trusted. Everyone was so eager to betray him. After throwing the soldier to the ground, he shouted and asked why it was like this and why he had to go through all this. Smashing the guy's face, he kept screaming until he calmed down. Getting up from the mangled soldier that was lying unconscious, he smiled evilly. Hadrian accepted the situation and said that it would only get more interesting in this case. He thought that everything would be fine. After all, God was on his side, and this was a test he had to pass. He was determined to ascend to the throne. The difference was only 10,000. Hadrian thought it a trifle, and that he would defeat Hercules. Taken aback and completely mad, Hadrian thought about Mrs. Gibral's words. He simply could not lose, because the future of Lemuria is in his hands. While the soldier came to his senses and wiped himself clean of blood, Hadrian ordered that enough of the sack throwing, and it was time to take up arms. Hercules noticed that the Bulgaronians had fulfilled part of the agreement. Unlike the personal armies of aristocrats, which are difficult to command, the Bulgaronian army is a national army, and the level of command is completely different. Now the main obstacle has been removed. Taking his sword out of its sheath, Hercules raised it up and said that it was time to fight his brother. He ordered all the participants in the battle to take their places. Hadrian shouted that God was on his side and ordered the army to destroy the traitors and kill the lying emperor. Archers and crossbowmen prepared to fight on both sides, and a hail of arrows flew in both directions. The army began to summon wind spirits and directed them at the enemy. They ordered them to tens after the arrows, and with the order, the insects flew to the attack. Hercules shouted to the heavy cavalry to advance. The soldiers struck a huge tambourine with the aim of the army's advance, and everyone rushed into battle. Galfes, Caroline, and Edmont were at the head of the army. Hadrian shouted to them not to hesitate and ordered the soldiers to blow their cavalry to smithereens. The cavalrymen began to fight among themselves. They began to summon the spirits of the wind, asking them to show the full might of their empire. Galfes summoned a huge spirit of Ammon. Together with the spirit, he swiftly overtook the enemy, keeping them terrified. The spirit swiftly struck a staggering expansive blow at the enemies. Galfes observed the men that turned to ashes and called them weaklings. Galfes said they could not stand against his rumbling footsteps. The enemy cavalry shouted at him that he was a traitor and servant of the false emperor. Edmund told Caroline that he would go forward, for he had not been on the battlefield for a long time and wanted to warm up. Caroline galloped away, and the cavalrymen shouted to the others that the brat wanted to run away. Two of the cavalrymen wanted to straighten up the old man and rushed after her. Edmund looked at them with a frightening look and said that it was wrong to call a person an old man who had only lived a little longer than them. In that case, he said he would start with the young men. Calling the spirit before him, he asked him to show Andromalius the place of these ignoramuses. Not realizing what was happening, the cavalrymen began to drown in an incomprehensible black slime. The warriors looked in horror at their hands, in which there were no weapons. The summoned spirit Andromalius possessed one ability. At random and a certain radius, he could steal things from people. At a maximum, he could steal from 300 soldiers. The soldiers were demanding their weapons back, some were missing their helmet. Caroline was already approaching the enemy, who asked her to stop, for he had no weapons. Without thinking for a second, Caroline speared the enemy at a gallop, shouting that it hurt her to look at them. Caroline told Edmund that her turn had come. Edmund noticed that Caroline had made a contract with the strongest spirit, Lygos. He thought she was a fine knight, and he was happy to fight beside her. While he was thinking about this, something fell right on his face. It was underpants. Edmund decided he would return it after the battle. Andromalius steals mostly weapons and armor, but occasionally things like this are caught. General Panther told His Majesty that his army is strong. Hercules said he had spent a lot of time training them. He originally wanted to send halberdiers to the front line, but the enemy sent crossbowmen to the vanguard. It was pointless to send halberdiers even with shields against them. Hercules wanted to try it out, but still gave up the idea. The general told him that it was a wise decision. He was sure that there would be more than a few more opportunities. By the way, he asked where Titus was now, and Hercules pointed his finger down. The crossbowmen ordered to fire at the enemy as a huge painted tiger pounced on them. The crossbowmen were terrified, not realizing where such a monster came from. Titus used the soldier's shield to lean on, and the soldier cowered at him. Without noticing it, Titus admired his creation with brush in hand. The soldiers asked His Highness to duck and keep his head down, for arrows were flying here. Unconcerned, Titus turned away and sat behind the soldiers, asking them to try to protect him. Naming the brush a decorabia, Titus proceeded with it to his next creation. Titus's spirit was decorabia. The juices secreted by this spirit gave life to the paintings. Titus decided that the next masterpiece would be a bird. Calling the bird to reality, he commanded it to dissect the traitors with its talons. The two-headed eagle swooped down on the enemy. Waving his tassel in front of him, Titus ordered his beautiful creation to fly forward. Upon reaching the enemy, the bird began to lift the soldiers upward with its clawed paws. Titus was simply delighted, for it had been so long since he had summoned a spirit, and despite his fatigue, the pictures were simply beautiful. There was no better feeling than the lively works. The soldiers gloomily glanced at His Highness, asking him to hide. Just then, Titus saw his eagle pierced by an arrow. The enemy crossbowmen noticed that it was just paper, so this smear shouldn't cause them any problems. Hearing this, Titus became furious. He ordered the death of anyone who mocked his art. The general hesitantly asked Hercules if his brother would be all right. Titus' spirit was quite useful, but he wasn't particularly hardy. Hercules thought it would only last for a couple more paintings. Hadrian punched the concrete fortress in rage and cursed. He cursed the damn false emperor and asked how dare they. Edmund himself was no threat, but Caroline was in their way. He ordered that at least Titus be killed, for he was no longer capable of using the spirit. Hadrian didn't understand why he was still alive. The crossbowmen couldn't last long in such a situation, and Hadrian ordered everyone to go forward. With his order, the tambourine sounded again. Hercules shouted that their infantrymen had started moving, which meant they had to act as well. Hercules ordered Titus to be taken to the fortress, and the crossbowmen to spread apart and retreat. The halberdiers came out to attack in their stead. Hercules looked at Darius, said that as they had planned, he leaves the command of the right flank on him. The Panther general smiled and said he knew what to do. Hercules was eager to see his brother's stupid face. Hercules walked along the wall of the fortress and smiled. Hadrian gritted his teeth with rage as he looked at his brother and thought about what he was up to. Hercules ordered the archers to retreat one by one on both sides, and the halberdiers were to cover the retreat and keep the enemies from getting through. The archers were to hasten, and the halberdiers held the formation. Darius shouted to the copjacks to cover the flanks and help hold the formation. The spearmen met the swordsmen who went to attack them. They were unable to advance. Hercules told Darius to conserve the army's strength and hold his men back from advancing. Hadrian shouted to the troops, calling them idiots. He didn't realize what they were doing. He ordered the light cavalry to stand in for the infantry, but Galfes with spirit could not allow that, and struck them. A terrible wave formed in front of the enemy cavalry, which made all the horses stir. Hadrian gritted his teeth in fury. He cursed Galfes despite the fact that his father held him in high esteem. He couldn't recognize his choice that he had chosen instead of him, his stupid little brother. Hadrian's army was exhausted, and Oscar looked worriedly toward the fortress with their emperor. He didn't understand what that idiot Hadrian was doing, for he was giving bad commands one after another. In addition, he looked at the movement of Hercules' army. He was moving towards their flank and was planning to surround them. Looking at the current formation of their army, it was clear that they were playing to Hercules' tune. In that case, they would lose this battle, and Oscar clenched his sword tighter as he thought about what to do next. Just then, he saw a soldier fall down beside him, struck by an arrow. At the same moment, a couple more arrows fell on him, but Oscar managed to protect his comrade with his shield. The soldier recognized Lord Oscar, and the guy asked the soldier if he could stand up. There are many privates and subordinates of the House of Alman here. He couldn't let the Alman clan be interrupted here. Oscar shouted to his comrade that he must save them all, and that they would definitely come back alive. Hadrian stared at the battle without understanding. His soldiers were not advancing, but the enemy did not show any desire to advance. A spearman struck the enemy, cutting off his head. After he fell, two covered the archer that had slipped past them. Hadrian was puzzled that the archers were not firing but going somewhere else. This couldn't be true, it was a formation. Hadrian cursed and shouted to the soldiers to retreat. Carolina, along with her father, defeated the enemies one by one. Hadrian didn't understand how this could happen and just stood there in shock. General Panther told Hercules that they had dealt with the light cavalry. It seemed to Hercules that Hadrian finally understood everything. A long time ago, there lived an old general. It was said that this legendary general passed through mountain ranges, making his way across half a continent and cornered the Lemurian Empire, and became known for his strategy. Many have tried this strategy, but it has not brought them victory. Without a proper understanding of the true nature of this strategy, all met only agonizing defeat. This strategy is based on a few details. The difference in the number of cavalrymen, the fighting power of the soldiers, and an exceptionally capable commander. These three conditions had to be met. Utilizing incredible tactics based on the speed at which armies move leads to magnificent results. Truly a strategy worth taking to the grave with you. This strategy of complete encirclement. Hadrian's army was completely surrounded. Hadrian demanded that the defenses be quickly overturned and shouted that Hercules would attack at them with archers. He ordered that everything be done quickly. The army, without having time to do anything, began to fall at a terrible rate. On all sides, they were pierced by arrows. Hadrian fell to his knees in complete shock. His entire army was on the verge of defeat. This strategy of complete encirclement is a guaranteed victory plan. Hence, it is incredibly difficult to achieve. And in the first place was the difference in numbers, which could be achieved by removing the Bulgarian cavalry that posed a real threat. They were able to provide conditions favorable to them for the removal of their troops without casualties and without fighting. This was the result that Emperor Hercules was aiming for. Fortunately, they canceled their mercenary contracts, expanded the standing imperial army, and thoroughly trained them. The Lemurian imperial army definitely had a hard time relying on unpredictable mercenaries in the past, fighting off the Bulgaronians. He was only able to implement this encirclement strategy because he carefully selected his generals. Choosing the right weapons is also a crucial factor in warfare. They would not have been able to outsmart the enemy soldiers if they had spades. The same would have been true if Hercules had equipped the soldiers with halberds. They would not have been able to fight off all the soldiers. In other words, one had to take the most suitable weapons to get a strong army. And there was one last piece of the mosaic. It was, of course, Darius. Up until now, Hercules couldn't hand out complex commands on his own to 20,000 men. There was no denying that just because he entrusted half of the army under his command, they were able to use the encirclement strategy. Rebuilding the army from scratch, improving the fighting capabilities of the warriors, removing foreign forces from the battlefield, allowing competent generals to completely dominate the battlefield. The soldiers started screaming and begging for mercy. They were willing to pay any amount of money for them to be spared. The soldier was a vassal of one of the 77 holy nobles, and if he died, their houses would not be silent. But before he could say anything more, he was pierced with the point of an axe. The troops spared no one. The soldiers covered themselves with their shields and shouted to their vassals that if they were really powerful, then let them do something about it. They were asking them to negotiate with Hercules. People were yelling in panic at each other to stop trampling each other's feet. Some asked if they even realized who they were fighting for. Hercules, seeing all this, laughed and asked if everyone could see it. He shouted to his brother Hadrian. He was grateful to him that now, because of him, he could repeat that incredible strategy from the legends with his own hands. Letting him be a younger brother, he was grateful to him for being such an obedient brother. Dalios silently watched the whole situation. He thought that it had been about 1,000 years since the encirclement strategy was invented, and the number of people who had tried to copy it and lost people was countless. Now the guy in front of him, who was barely 15 years old, had successfully managed it. He smiled and thought about the fact that elves lived for about 200 years, which meant that His Majesty still had another 185 years of experience ahead of him. He looked at Hercules through his spirit eye and said he was looking forward to the future. Hercules interrogated him as he didn't hear him. Panther said it was no big deal and called it thinking out loud. Now the only thing left was to make sure they couldn't break through and cut them off. Dalios asked His Majesty not to lower the defenses. But Hercules himself was well aware of that. But still, the strategy is hard to maintain. It's like filling your skin with water to the limit. However, in this position, while the arrows were falling on them, Dalios didn't think there would be a competent commander who could calm the panicking soldiers and rally them to break the formation. Hercules said it didn't matter, for until a worthy commander could be found among them, they would never get out of the encirclement. Not a single fly was to escape from this trap. With these words, one of the warriors knocked out some archers and dashed forward. Dalios and Hercules looked at the enemy with surprise. It was Oscar who said with a puff of breath that the House of Almond would not be defeated today. Covered by shields, the enemy warriors created a shield lane that covered them from all sides. Oscar commanded everyone to follow him forward. The warrior shouted to the archers to quickly restore the formation and not let anyone break through. Hercules, watching what was happening, asked Darius if he could break through the encirclement alone like that. Darius said that to get out alive from the encirclement with luck 1 in 100. Hercules understood him and thought that now that chance was 1 in 10. Well, not that it would decide the outcome of the battle, besides it would leave a stain on Hercules' reputation. Dalios laughed at his words and said that even the great general of the imperial Lemurian army himself had abandoned the battlefield a couple times, and that was not something to be ashamed of. Hercules smiled and asked Dalios to take a look at the warrior. The hero believed that they had found another outstanding talent. Most of the nobles under Hadrian's predecessor were destroyed in a hail of arrows as Hercules surrounded them. As for those who led the mercenaries, who stayed behind, who took no part in the battle but raised funds for the army, they were all arrested by Christa's men. But what about Hadrian, the leader of the rebellion? All that was left of him was his helmet, and he escaped. He came to the kingdom of Balgarin to seek asylum from them. But the warriors looked at each other and grabbed Hadrian under the arms. Hadrian was in shock and didn't realize what they were doing. He demanded to be released and asked what they were up to. The king's servants asked him to speak their language so that he could understand it. Even if he did, Hadrian had to understand for himself what was going on here. Trying to seek refuge in the kingdom of Balgarin, he was arrested and brought before the court of Lemuria. So Hadrian's plan to usurp the throne failed miserably. Thus, for the entire duration of the war, Hercules' army had 3,700 survivors, while Hadrian had none left. Hadrian, the traitor to the throne, was brought to trial. On the 3rd day after the suppression of the rebellion, Hadrian, as well as 100 other conspirators, would be sentenced for their crimes. The judge flipped through the pages of notes he had on his desk and asked for short and concise answers. Hercules, being the judge, asked the guilty man why he had taken part in the battle. But the man said that he did it for the sake of protecting His Majesty Hercules from dangers from within. Since this was so, Hercules asked for an answer as to why the man had then proclaimed Hadrian emperor. The boy was frightened by this question and blanched. It was obvious that he was lying, and Hercules saw it perfectly well. The judge smirked and asked if it was because he was dragged away with him. Not understanding anything, the surprised guy said yes. The aristocrats, who had more power and authority than him, had swindled his fortune and his soldiers. The judge asked the guilty man if he knew who was responsible. It seems, though, that he was just trying to hoodwink him. Interrupted by words, the man agreed that he was being tried to cheat. Hercules asked him who it was. As the man was about to answer, Galfes thought about the fact that he was covering his own skin by throwing the blame on the more powerful aristocrats. If he valued his life so much, he should have joined His Majesty instead of kneeling down now. Hercules said that if he was indeed one of the participants in the rebellion, he would be executed with his family like everyone else. However, his family had served the Giuliano's family faithfully for years, and he could not turn a blind eye to that. The man looked hopefully at Hercules. As the head of the family, he was sentenced to 30 years of hard labor. His family, his vassals, as well as their families, Hercules promised to look after them personally. That was the end of it. The man bowed to the floor and thanked His Majesty from the bottom of his heart. He promised not to forget his mercy for the rest of his life. Hercules was not particularly moved by this and merely gave him a nod of assent. Taking the paper in her hand, Caroline, who was standing next to the judge, heard someone being sentenced to the rest of his life. Hercules had no doubt that in 3 years no one would remember about it and called the next one. With a smile, the judge asked the culprit if he had been cheated. He asked all the same questions of the lower aristocrats and thus got a legitimate reason to commute the sentence. There were several reasons for this. The first was that you couldn't just go ahead and execute all the aristocrats. During the rebellion, they had crushed many noble houses. Eventually, their influence waned. The resulting void in power will open up opportunities for the lesser houses. Those will surely take advantage of this and gain influence and take over the positions of the former great houses. Reason 2 was that having lost the remnants of influence, the nobility was no longer a threat to imperial power. They had lost everything during the war, and even without his help, only their name remained of their former power. It was for this reason that a sentence of imprisonment, fine, and forced labor would be a reasonable solution. The third and final reason, one of the key figures on Hadrian's side. He wielded considerable influence in the political arena. A top aristocrat and part of the half-elven nobility, the judge summoned him to the courtroom, but he was aware of his position and believed that he would not dare be executed. He apologized in writing to the emperor, and there was a certain smirk on his face. And even if all the members of the imperial court welcomed him to the court, among them were those who remained indebted to him, and with their support he could get away unpunished. Being confident of his safety, he knew that Hercules would have to resort to drastic measures in this situation. Hans was a self-confident fool who asked to explain everything to his majesty. Hercules said that several accusations had been made against him, for which Hans only lightly apologized. But Hercules tore up his paper, saying that he was sentenced to the imperial ban. From that moment on, he would lose his noble status. Hans was just shocked at the sentence and couldn't believe it. His face immediately changed, and he begged the judge to wait with the sentence. Hercules said that he would be isolated for the rest of his days. After his demise, his remains would be consigned to the fire. May his suffering be eternal. As the soldiers led him away, he shouted across the hall. He screamed that Hercules couldn't do this to him because he was a high nobleman. He couldn't treat him like a black man. He begged to kill him and let him die with honor. Eventually, he was led out of the hall. That was the end of it, and Hercules called for the next one. From the beginning, his target was the high nobility. In short, he wanted to punish the normally untouchable nobles by making them responsible for the actions of the lower nobles. He ensured that those present in the hall could not challenge his decision. In addition, the nobles who had to surrender their recent allies were now unlikely to dare to oppose him in the future. By plotting a coup, there was no guarantee that he could maintain his life, even if he decided to join forces with the other houses. One of the main objectives of this play is to allow the younger nobles to see the full picture of the event. Imprisonment and confiscation of property for the lower nobles, and an imperial ban for the higher nobles. This method allowed him to rid the Lemurian court of a couple dozen great houses. And finally, there was the last one left. Hadrian walked into the courtroom. Christopher pushed him forward, and he fell straight to his knees in front of the judge. Hadrian wanted to snap at him. How dare he do that? But Christopher ordered him to shut his mouth. After all, he is standing in front of His Majesty the Emperor. Hadrian gritted his teeth with anger and looked at the judge. Hercules smiled and told his older brother that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. He tried to recall the last time they had a face-to-face conversation with him. Or perhaps it was the first time. He'd only heard of him from his buddy Dominicus. That very poison melon was his handiwork. Because of it, he saw for the first time how poison affects silver, calling it amazing. Hercules also said that the dish was wonderful. Salty melon, sweet tomatoes, and poison, it was an exquisite combination. Ironically, he said he didn't eat it, so he couldn't say that for sure. The battle on the plain will clearly go down in history, largely of course due to the use of full encirclement tactics. He was willing to bet that in a few hundred years, he was the only one who had managed to successfully apply this strategy. Hercules asked his brother if he realized that he and the Bulgarian army had some chance of victory. In open battle, with the support of the Bulgarian and the mercenaries they had gathered, perhaps they could have defeated him. Hadrian quietly told the emperor that he was not worthy of the imperial throne. He should have inherited the throne from his father, who kept saying so. But from the moment Hercules was born, his father had given everything to him, a brat who had no right to the throne. He shouted to the bailiffs and everyone in the audience that they had been duped by this lying emperor. He said that he could not be allowed to continue to sit on that throne. This prophecy was unsent to him by the great archangel Jibril himself. He had been chosen by the gods themselves. And at last he was the rightful emperor of the great Lemurian Empire. The humans mentioned Gabriel and asked if he had really been appeared to by the very same. The archangel, whom no one had seen, had appeared to Hadrian. Hadrian shouted that it was true, and as proof, he had a feather from her wing. Hercules understood him and asked him in that case to invite Gabrielle herself to this chamber. If he could do that, it would recognize him as the true emperor in front of everyone. Caroline and everyone else looked at Hercules in shock. Hadrian laughed, and with a grin said that he would regret his words. He shouted for Lady Gabrielle to appear in front of everyone. He demanded that she send the scum of the false emperor to the depths of hell. But nothing happened. Silence fell, and Hercules wanted to ask his brother, but he asked for a moment, promising that she would appear. He shouted what he could to Lady Gabrielle and asked her to appear right away. Hercules looked coldly at his brother and said that he had 3 conditions, and if he complied with them, he would stay alive. First, he had to swear loyalty and unquestioning obedience to his emperor. 2, he must recognize the illegal invasion of his territory. And 3, he must accept responsibility for the actions of the great nobles who went after him. Then he can spare his life as their mother wished. Hadrian, without raising his head, pronounced that he recognized his guilt for what had happened and was fully responsible for it. He asked Hercules for mercy. Hercules remarked that this was a wise decision. The accused Hadrian Julianos, the leader of the rebellion, is hereby decreed to be sentenced to life imprisonment. Hercules demanded that he be taken back to the dungeon. As soon as the soldiers wanted to take Hadrian away, the guilty man cut the ropes with scissors and slashed the soldiers. He shouted to Hercules that he was about to kill him and tried to attack him. At this point, Caroline pounced on Hercules to cover him, while Christopher and Galfes prepared to repel Hadrian's blow. Just then, the very archangel Jibril appeared right in front of everyone's eyes, mentioning God and saying that this was not the way to do it. Hadrian looked at the archangel in shock. He asked her in horror why she was defending this false emperor. After all, she herself had said he was the true emperor. Everyone around him couldn't understand who he was talking to. No one could see anyone. The girl laughed and said that she didn't tell him about the murder. She said that the impostor was Hadrian himself and advised him not to try, for he would never be emperor. He didn't understand what she was saying because he was chosen by the gods, just like she said. The girl smiled and said that it could not be true for one reason only. Reincarnated, Gabrielle showed her true colors. She was the demon Hercules. Hadrian froze in horror, and Hercules gloatingly looked at his brother and wished him luck. Hadrian was simply out of his mind. He shouted various insults in his brother's direction. He demanded that he give him back his crown. Galfes called him a freak, noting that he had finally lost his mind. Christopher said that under no circumstances should this be mentioned on His Majesty's grave. The Deviless that lay in the air behind the emperor's back asked to accept her congratulations. Thus, all the guilty were punished. Thanks to that, the festive banquet went off without a problem. And finally, there was one more thing. Hercules looked and asked the man if he could guess why he was here. He was addressing Oscar Ullman, who was looked at angrily by the general and Galfes. Oscar bowed before the emperor, saying that he had bared his sword against him and was ready to suffer any punishment. Hercules said he had it all wrong, and he wasn't going to judge him. He looked at the 2 men and said that these 2 old men were bullying Oscar. Hercules had a proposition for Oscar. He wanted him to become a general, which shocked the boy. He didn't understand how this could be, since he had fought on the enemy's side. Hercules said that he had been watching him and the House of Ullman for a long time. However, since the head of his house sided with Hadrian in the fight for the throne, he had to be arrested and stripped of his lands and rank. When the head of his house decided to side with Hadrian, he had to follow them and had no choice. Thus he found himself on board a sinking ship. For this reason, his house fell under the crush. He had greatly affected the course of the war. But Oscar was sure that he was not much suited for the role, and there were others who would be better suited for the role of a general. But Hercules didn't know what he was even talking about. After all, he was the one who was able to break out of the encirclement. Oscar was surprised that Hercules saw this. The ringing tactic was designed to sow panic in the enemy ranks by depriving them of the ability to resist. But he escaped the ring of this torture. While inside the ring, under the onslaught of enemy forces, he remained calm and thus was able to save the lives of his subordinates. Under equal circumstances, anyone else would have thought it impossible. Hercules praised his leadership skills, and the mighty army needed outstanding generals. Hercules said that with his help, their army would become even stronger. Also, he thought that this was a great opportunity for him to restore the honor and glorious name of his house. Oscar was most grateful to His Majesty. The House of Ullman owed him a debt of gratitude. Hercules asked not to speak of this trifle. House Ullman was henceforth at his complete disposal, and they would do anything for the future of the country. Most of their family members were stripped of their nobility status and sent to jail. Although they escaped the highest punishment, the imprisonment broke the head of their house. Because of this incident, their house suffered a lot. If he agrees to His Majesty's proposal, he can restore the former glory of the House of Alman. In addition, Hercules turned a blind eye to all the crimes of his family. After all this happened, His Majesty personally invited him to join him, and recognized him as worthy of his trust. Oscar bowed and asked him to take care of him, as he didn't quite have enough experience yet. Hercules smiled and hoped that he would work well with these old men. Oscar smiled and agreed with him. Finally, it was all over. The two glasses clinked against each other. In a dark room lit only by candles sat Caroline and Hercules. Hercules agreed with her. After dealing with his father's former vassal countries, his older brother immediately rebelled. Who would have thought that the emperor would have so many worries? But thanks to that, after working so hard, all the food seems especially delicious. Caroline smiled and said that the head chef has really come alive lately. She was happy to hear that Canner-san was still able to influence the chief. Hercules looked at Carolina while sipping from his glass. He moved closer to her face and asked why she was talking about other men when they were alone with her. Caroline was confused and said that wasn't what she meant. She said she had been waiting for this opportunity for a long time too. Hercules stared at Caroline in her shirt, who looked at Hercules incomprehensibly. Hercules smirked and assumed that this was the reason why she had chosen such a revealing outfit. He still couldn't forget how she had blushed in that maid's costume. He laid Caroline down on the couch and, stroking her cheek, he offered her to be his wife. The girl was surprised at such a proposal. Looking at the grapes, Hercules broke off a sprout and wove a ring from it, putting it on Caroline's finger. Caroline looked at her hand. Taking the girl's hand, he said that he loved her and would like her to be his consort. Together, they could build a bright future for this country. Caroline burst into tears. She smiled sincerely and agreed with His Majesty. The people welcomed the emperor, who was able to breathe new life into the Lemurian Empire, which was once on the verge of falling into the abyss that spanned 3 continents. His name was Hercules I. His exploits, his reign under the title of Emperor of Divine Light. The story of the emperor who conquered 3 continents. His story continues now. Hercules, accompanied by Caroline, waved with a smile to all the people.